Hey everybody, Jimmy with the Triple C Collective here, and today on this commentary track, we're going to be talking about yoga hosers. And with me, my co-host for today, you guys might remember him from our Collected Conversations interview. It is Mr. Erik Pflueger.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to my nightmare. And it will be an interesting ride today. Um, First of all, thank you for having me on
Of course.
again. Um, Second of all, just those of you who may have seen the previous show may have recalled me having more hair than this. Don't worry, I haven't joined a cult. I'm not a skinhead. I haven't turned into Walter White. I'm not the one who knocks. My hair simply gets very thick, very oily, very quickly, and there was really no choice in the matter. Sometimes you just got to mow the lawn, otherwise you feel nothing but just incredible discomfort. Now, you may want to tell the audience that you yourself are growing your hair out in preparation for a shave, but for much more noble reasons than just I got uncomfortable one day.
Absolutely. I raised money for St. Baldrick's, which is a foundation for to help kids that are battling cancer. My goal this year is to try and raise $1,000 for that. So yeah, I'll keep a link in the description here. Thanks for bringing that up. I really appreciate that.
My pleasure. And anyone out there who wants to give to the cause, please be sure to do so. It's a noble cause.
Thank you.
Um, oh boy, what a show we'll have.
Right?
Because of all the Kevin Smith's films I've seen, and I have had both work and pleasure related cause to see them all and more than once. Yoga Hosers is the one that I watch more than any other. It's the one I find most bizarrely the most pleasure out of watching, for reasons that aren't readily apparent on the surface. Uh, they will become apparent because I'm going to explain the living cheese out of them, but we'll get there. And
Let me ask a question. When did you first see Yoga Hosers? Did you see it in that like special event in theaters? Did you get to see it like first when it came home on like home video? When did you first see Yoga Hosers?
Good question. The answer is the former. I went to the theater. I'm trying to remember at what hour it was. Was it a midnight screening? Was it something else? Don't recall. Was that my local theater? I went for the same reason I went to see Tusk. Tusk had earned an incredible amount of goodwill with me because, and with my wife Yvette, who became as much an enthusiast for Kevin as I did, and that would have been regardless of whether or not I had been given the privilege of doing any work for him, which I
Mm-hmm.
have. Um, we both simply admired the sheer moxie of having a discussion that came out of a podcast of a bizarre walrus related story, and then he literally pushed whimsy as he calls it all the way to completion point and put it on film. uh, Therefore, Tusk had earned an incredible amount of enthusiasm from us. Obviously, Yoga Hosers is a different tone than Tusk, even though it's
Absolutely.
set in the same True North universe.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I felt the same sort of enthusiasm. I had the same goodwill towards it. Um, I found in it, particularly in the film, in between the lines of the film as it's seen, some incredibly interesting material to be mined. But that is something we're going to have to get to very shortly. Um, do I own it? Yes. I also have it on Blu-ray. I did not hesitate. It's the very same one you're pointing to. I have too much in my office to have the Kevin shelf out there. Also, I have so much damn subjects. I have an extensive library for a reason. In the days of the pre-Google image search period, you really had no choice but to use specialized books with specialized reference images. And even in the Google image search period that we're living in, they're still quite useful. Um, Obscure information can be found that way. But that doesn't leave a whole lot of room on those shelves for the Kevin material. They're on another shelf off camera, but they're there. Next question.
Well, so aside from the like owning it, seeing it in theater, I actually didn't see it until it came out on home video. I missed that because it was like a smaller event. It wasn't like a wide release similar to Tusk. It was just like a few little theaters or a few theaters throughout the country and whatnot that had it going on. But I was all in on this True North trilogy. Like from
Mm,
Tusk, I was Walrus, yes, from the beginning. I still really hope after Jay and Silent Bob Store Wars that we get some Moose Jaws happening to finish off the trilogy. That would be great. Um, but if I'm being honest, I wasn't super warm to this movie when I first watched it. But the more I watched it, the more it grew on me. And now that I have like my daughter is 6 now, and when I was watching this for our pod, there's the on the title menu, there's Kevin as a Bratzi going Wunderbar. So now my daughter, who is 6 years old, is walking around imitating Kevin Smith as a Bratzi, saying Wunderbar, Wunderbar, and it is like one of the funniest things in the world because
she'll
she's
have
6.
German. She'll have German nailed before she even has English fully nailed. Um, None of that surprises me because I have a very strong suspicion based on what Kevin has said that this is for girls.
Mm-hmm.
In a sense, I obviously love it to the point where that's not strictly true. It's for me also. And I'm so not that. But if we're talking about something that gives girls heroes to follow, to be inspired by, a story to be amused by, even even an interestingly saccharine take on a horror story. This is that. I
Mm-hmm.
obviously like it for different reasons that are than are apparent on the surface, but if we are dealing strictly with the surface, yes, it works as such. I'm not surprised your daughter felt that way. And it's kind of adorable that she's trying to emulate a giant not a giant,
Mm-hmm.
far from a sausage person,
Mm-hmm.
but also see if that gets her into the taste of bratwurst because it's actually quite good.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm a big fan.
Quite just as an aside to get that out of the to get it out of the way because this was going to come up at some point. I love bratwurst. Um, I didn't have it for a long time because my wife was a very difficult sell on it because whenever you see it in package in the store, it's very gray colored and
Mm-hmm.
that was disquieting to her. But we found a Johnsonville brand that where they look at least somewhat pink before
Mm-hmm.
preparation. And I'm like, honey, please, can I? I swear, just try it. Just once, try it. And she became a huge convert. Now I can't bring up the word bratwurst without her salivating, and she can't wait until I prepare it. The secret is to slow steam it all day on very
Okay.
low heat. It's juicy and it's got a spice to it that is entirely different from Italian sausages, even up to and including the spicy ones, but it's more wholesome in a certain way. God knows how. It's not something I could put into words. I can tell you I can't stand sauerkraut, then or now, but
Yep.
Yvette does. Somehow our marriage works. Uh,
Yeah. Sauerkraut, not a fan.
mm, mm.
Um, not
And I
for me.
certainly wouldn't want it in my blood.
No. However, you know what? Like, I will take coffee straight to the vein.
Yeah.
Um, that is
Speaking
the
of,
lifeline, right?
this is Rise coffee. It's very good. A bit better for you than the real stuff and just delicious. And we've got creamer that's equal parts raspberry with a hint of chili in it.
Whoa.
Yes,
Whoa.
delish.
That,
It'll keep my throat managing because I'll sound like Darth Sidious at the end of this if I don't keep the damn throat lubricated. Make a joke of that if you will. Next question, please.
So, I mean, well, we were kind of talking about some of the things that like we liked, some of our like almost favorite things of this. So let's just kind of dive into that right there. Do you have a like a favorite scene or a favorite like line of dialogue, maybe a couple of lines of dialogue or a couple of scenes or anything that you were just like the first time you watched it or every time on like the rewatch, you're just like, I just can't get enough of this. I just love it.
If I have several of those, but the first and foremost one is one that Kevin knows I like, and so does Harley because it's her line. Uh, I sent a still of same where she's hit in the head by a box of cereal thrown by one of the Bratzies, and she goes, "Oh, ho, 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 you piece of shit!" Favorite line in the movie, possibly one of my favorite line deliveries in film, because it's incredibly Warner Brothers in its delivery. It's just hysterical. The amount of a meal that Harley makes of a line that is utterly mundane otherwise. Oh, you piece of shit. Oh, you piece of shit. It is something out of Bob Clampett. It is something out of the best cartoons. And that's one of the reasons why Yoga Hosers functions on that level.
Mhm.
Uh, but it's just an exceptional line delivery for uh, someone that is shaping up to be an incredibly good actress.
Yes.
She has an immense presence. She's also shaping up as a model, so she knows how to convey that presence visually. She's striking. She's very sweet. And I had the honor of being able to tell her that I liked that line, but with nowhere near as much intellectual rigor as I'm delivering it now because I was starstruck.
Hmm.
When I shook her hand, I think I was a bit too tight in my grip. It can be a bit strong of a grip. And oh my God, I'm micro critiquing my behavior from 8 years ago, but I do think that strongly about it. Um, Kudos to Harley, and I hope she manages to hear this. Um, yes, it's
It's
entirely
awesome because
possible.
my like one of my favorite lines of dialogue is also delivered from Harley. It's not that one, but it's also the callback to Clark's of where she's like, "I'm not even supposed to be here today," and then she does the like yoga pose basically and kills all the Bratzies by doing the headstand and like falling onto them.
Yes.
Um, I love it. It's obviously just like such a classic callback of clerks being in the convenience store and stuff. Like for me, like I just love that. I also I also do love on how the Colleens make fun of Adam Brody's Ichabod. They're just giving him zingers at the entire beginning of it, and he's just like, "You guys wouldn't think that way if I was covered in tattoos and stuff."
Turns out he was wrong. They
Right?
were just the same. Um, I had a like for I don't want to die in Canada. There's no other way out. Anybody who lives in Southwest Florida has that same sort of existential dread. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. Um, I loved, I loved Yogi Berra. Uh, that's an eccentric character, but I love Justin Long's going smarter than what average bear. That just came out of nowhere and it made me laugh. Um, what else? Let me scoot this so that I can semi follow along with my notes. They are extensive. And by the way, you guys are unfortunately going to be cursed to see not only the reflection of my glasses, but to see my eyes darting back and forth across the screen like a dumbass as I check these notes out. But there's no other way I can do this. Okay. Major kudos. Loved Austin Butler as the character of Hunter Calloway. And the reason I do is, yeah, he's fucking dreamy, but more importantly, Kevin clearly saw that he was capable of being a compelling villain to watch on screen. And it's to his credit that he recognized that and put it to good use. Long before he was Fade Routha Harkonnen, he was Hunter Calloway. I thank you for your sacrifice. And uh, I hope that Kevin gives himself a regular pat in the back for having that amount of prescience. Because good on him and good on Austin.
Hmm.
I'm very enthusiastic about the way his career is going. He's going to do just fine. Um, Next question, please.
I guess then, is there a favorite scene that you have? Like, because for me, I don't really have necessarily just a favorite scene. Some of my favorite stuff that we see throughout the movie, though, is the Colleen's singing, whether it's like with Ichabod and their band, or whether it's at Colleen C's house where like Tony Hale is like just like bawling next to Natasha Leone, um, or
Oh,
even at the
poor
end,
bastard.
yeah, right, or at the end credits when they're like singing "Oh Canada" and stuff. Me and one of my like best friends, oldest friends, Mac Music. He's the guy who does the music for our podcast and stuff here. He and I were in a band making music back when we were 12, 13 years old in like eighth grade and seventh grade and stuff. And like we've just been carrying that on now for like 20 plus years. So for seeing that there, it was just like, oh my God, I love it. It was just like, because it's like a part of my life. Like grant it, like I'm not a Canadian little girl or whatever. Like
No.
these are fictional characters, but
Oh, we'll get
um,
to that meme. Give it a minute.
right, but it was just something that that just meant a lot to me, like in these rewatches. I was like, man, that is special, having something like that, like friends just getting together, like whatever it is, if you're making movies, if you're making art, making music or something, like that was just something that I was just like, that's really special, that's really nice to have.
Would that I could relate to that mindset. I was never a band man. I've done covers for bands, and that's about it. My ambition is to stage an opera. And I suppose that radically different mindset has been of good use to Kevin, but, and hopefully it has. I'd like to think that it has. I flatter myself. But yeah, I like the use of sticks also. My wife Yvette is a sticks person, just
Mm-hmm.
behind being a Pink Floyd person. No one can accuse her of having bad musical taste. And they do an excellent cover on it.
Mm-hmm.
The harmonizing is different than Styx would do. Okay. But it's touching. It's on the touching being undercut by Tony Hale becoming a blubber pile, but
Mm-hmm.
very well done. And oh, Canada, yeah, and that has some thematic and symbolic meaning because after the experience they've had in this film, they've suddenly acquired a new sense of patriotism that they didn't
Right.
necessarily have before. There's no evidence that they had that at the beginning of the film, but they clearly do at the end. They have been reacquainted with their Canadian forebears fighting off fascism.
Right.
Uh, and we will go into exactly how that went down in a bit more detail than the film does. Uh, oh my, Will, the story on that is actually rather compelling. And it's real, with the exception of the Andronicus Arcane character being inserted into that in a way not different than Herman Wouk inserted his own Henry family characters into the narrative of the Second World War, also in his books. Winds of War, War and Remembrance. But okay, a little bit of fiction to help the fact go down, spoonful of sugar and all that. Um, that's fine by me. And my own knowledge of history, which is still that of a layman and only that, really does inform why I feel a certain amount of enthusiasm of the film that others might not. But we'll get to that as well. Next question, please.
I guess what is now, so we talked about our favorite scenes and lines of dialogue. Do you have a favorite character or characters? I know for myself, like I've talked about it, I really like the Colleens. I think
Mhm.
Lily Rose and Harley do just like a great job in their friendship and stuff like that. Again, the band aspect of it, I worked at a video store, not a convenience store, growing up and stuff. So like there was just a lot of things of them in that movie that just like totally related to me the same way that like I related to like Clerks and all of that. So I think it's probably them. I will give a good shout out. I think I really think Johnny Depp is Guy Lapointe. Just like he's really funny. He was great in Tusk. He's awesome in this. I find him to be very funny. I think him at the end going opposite of Ralph Garman when Ralph is doing all the voices and like Johnny Depp's like reactions is like, oh, that's not bad. He's pretty good and stuff. You know, like
It's the nod he gives when Ralph breaks into Adam West that
yep.
I love the most. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
um, there's a lot to be said about that, and I'm scrolling down to those notes to get them out of the way now, whereas I could have done them when talking about the whole murder spree aspect of this. There'll be a bit of scrolling, and I apologize in advance. I'm organized, but only to a point. Um, Here we go. I like Guy Lapointe as a character, period.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, as a character, he's an excellent example of the archetype of the secret or not so secret genius detective. And the examples I have are Lieutenant Kinderman from The Exorcist and Legion, which became The Exorcist 3.
Mm-hmm.
Set of stories I love almost in excess of the amount of love they might deserve. But okay. Uh, there's Lieutenant Columbo, obviously. There's possibly Benoit Blanc, but because he doesn't keep his genius a secret necessarily, he flaunts it. All of them hide or try to hide their razor sharp intellect behind some outward comical defect or an eccentricity of some kind, absent-mindedness, southern hokum, or just plain ugliness. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but I set down a name, a line in the original pilot for Columbo, the TV film Diagnosis Murder, which, no, Prescription Murder, is the difference, which is worth watching, by the way. The character who is the murderer and the investigator who knows he is the murderer but doesn't say it yet had a conversation, and the killer says, "You're an intelligent man, Columbo, but you hide it. You pretend you're something you're not. Why? Because of your appearance. You think you cannot get by on looks or polish, so you turn a defect into a virtue. You take people by surprise. They underestimate you, and that's where you trip them up. And no one is going to argue that Guy Lapointe can get by on looks. Not when he has a mole that constantly switches position on his face, depending on what shot he's in. Can people see it crawling around on his face between shots? Ugh, gross. And polish? Forget it. But that being said, he's very compelling as a character, and I always and still do have the opinion that there is so much potential to be mined with Guy Lapointe as a character. I don't know whether he would turn up in Moose Jaws or not. Uh, I don't even know whether Moose Jaws would be made or not. I have a slight suspicion that Cocaine Bear may have stolen the thunder of that to a certain degree. That may not stop Kevin. I don't know if it should stop Kevin. If he can deliver a take that's different, by all means, he should. Um, Let him try. I have my own thoughts on what I would do with the Guy Lapointe character, but that's between me and Kevin. And at some point, perhaps, I may present those thoughts to him, along with variations on all the thoughts I'm probably going to let out. But all of that is really because you were very kindly offering me an intro into the character that I do think is my favorite character. But the answer to that and the answer to why I think that is going to be quite involved. And quite extensive, and you'll probably end up just going, yeah, go on.
Mhm.
And that would be the sole content you contribute for an hour or more. You are warned. The audience is warned. Um, it's one of those strap in conversations, but I think I can make some good meal out of it. It's like John Lennon said, get me a tuba, I'll bring you something out of it. And I intended to bring something rather unique to me out of this particular tuba. And fortunately, I've got a lot of liquid there to keep the throat from dying while I do that. And the answer is simple. The character I like the most, the character I find the most fascinating, most engaging, is Andronicus Arcane, played to aplomb by the great Ralph Garman, uh, who, as I've said before, pushed the button on my career that I had with Kevin by deciding that he wanted to get a painting I had done that Kevin particularly favored to Kevin as a Christmas gift. And in doing so, he gave my grandkids a Christmas that year. He gave my grandkids a Christmas the following year when he bought another pair of paintings from me for Kevin. And then Kevin took it from there and has been exceedingly generous with me and kind with me and tolerant towards me. And between the two of them, that's why I'm on whatever map I am on today. Um, and for that, I am exceedingly grateful. And I hope I won't cock it up by doing all of this in depth. But from what I understand, Kevin has an interest in hearing what I have to say on this. Let's hope he finds it worth it.
I hope
Um,
so. That'd be
okay.
great.
And you'd better at least jump in with the occasional or whatever on the occasion, or my throat will just crash. But and in a sense, we are going over the plot of the film by presenting all of what I'm about to present, but we're doing it through the back door. Uh, we're doing kind of what Anne Rice did in retelling the plot of Interview with a Vampire from Lestat's perspective in The Vampire Lestat. Uh, hell, I think E.L. James did the same by retelling her stories through uh, her main character's perspective, but I don't know enough about E.L. James and the 50 Shades stories to talk about that with any sort of skill, and I'm probably better off not between you and me and the gatepost. But okay, so are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's strap
Oh,
in.
okay. A little prologue. Um, what I am doing with this is essentially what Clerks did to Star Wars. Uh, Star Wars is what it is, but what fans did was sort of expand outwards in an attempt to kind of, I suppose, to find the frontiers of the fictional universe that the film set up. And what did Kevin do as part of that? Uh, he has Randall talking about, I bet they had to bring in independent contractors on that. And that was an act of deconstruction and reconstruction. And it's the scene that I think may have put Clerks over the top as being a cult film of significance. It succeeds on its own merits, whether that scene existed or not.
I
But
mean, that scene made it to The Mandalorian as well. Bill Burr talks about it in Mandalorian, I think season 2, when they're about to go break into a in like a first order, basically kind of like stronghold or whatever. And but yeah, he talks about it. He's like, no, that Death Star 2, they were independent contractors and stuff. They were innocent people up there. There wasn't like the first Death Star. And it like John Favreau talks about including that into that Mandalorian episode because of Clerks and Kevin Smith and stuff. It was like a real full circle moment there.
it goes higher up the chain than that because George Lucas himself made reference to it in the commentary track for Attack of the Clones.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect that he made the thing be a matter of the Death Star originally being assembled by Geonosian termites, be as a sort of comment on that, a playful one. Um, but that's when you know you've arrived in pop culture, when the commentary on your scene goes that high, and
Right.
it's because it's delivered that cleverly. What I'm doing now is basically taking his film, this one being Yoga Hosers, and subjecting it to the same treatment writ large. And it's not a question of, well, let's see how you like it, Kevin. I'm sure he'll like it just fine. Hopefully he will. It's simply that the film met me as a viewer and the two collided, and I realized there was more there. There was more to the character of Andronicus Arcane there. And I feel quite strongly that what is implied to be there would make for a very compelling story on its own. A story that in tone would be radically different from Yoga Hosers, but that's fine. Um, it's a story that would have to be told in three sections because we're dealing essentially with three different kinds of story. Um, it's we're talking, I mean, just in the very basics, the villain, Arcane, is a character that is equal parts Mengele and something out of Thomas Harris, the serial
Hmm.
killer as aesthete. And I love the novels of Thomas Harris. He's one of my favorite prose constructors in novels. Um, what the story would be, it would be a coming of age story. It's a historical drama. It's a crime drama. It's a candy. It's a mint. Uh, the result of it in tone would be equal parts actual Yoga Hosers, yes, but also Better Call Saul and the Valachi papers, in that it's about how a character embarks upon a moral and ethical decline, but also The Boys from Brazil, in that it explores bizarrely outlandish mad science experiments for entirely evil purposes, but also The Empty Mirror, in that it's an exploration of the extremely diseased and distorted mental state of its central character, who is locked in a pseudo Wagnerian mental prison of his own making. And also Mindhunter and or Monster, the Andronicus Arcane story, in that it's about a proxy serial murderer pursuing goals that are entirely incomprehensible to investigators, but make complete sense to him. And the possibilities in all of that are not endless, but they are pretty broad. And if told and told properly, I think it would be extremely compelling. Um, and what that caused me to do is what Kevin does all the time, chasing whimsy. And that particular chase to date has taken at least a year and a half, has caused me to look through between 20 or 30 books of varying subjects, three books on Adrian Arcand alone, some of whom contributed by friends of mine. Thank you, Chris Vasco, because I couldn't afford them, along with something like 15 films or documentaries on the subject, including Tuscan Yoga Hosers themselves. If they're not the foundation, what are we doing here?
Fair.
Um, yeah, and in the course of that research, I consulted with a lot of people, people who lived in Winnipeg to get a sense of the city there, uh, all kinds of people. Even the author of one of the books I consulted was perfectly willing to help out because, as he said, and I quote, I love Kevin Smith and his works. Maybe I can help.
That's
Kevin
awesome.
opens a lot of doors, even in this particular case. Uh, Torsten Homburger, the assistant professor of history at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. Whew, what a ride this has been. And now you all are forced to go on it.
Buckle up, buttercups.
Strap in. And two caveats: one humorous, one deadly serious. Humorous first. Um, I actually got this when consulting with some people. who wanted to be a bit smartass about it. And they would punch up, hey man, you got to remember, and they would punch up the Ben Affleck frame from Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back. You got to remember, these are fictional characters, fictional characters. And uh, that kind of exhausted me. And so whenever they brought up that Ben Affleck meme, the thing that actually popped into my mind was the Ben Affleck meme where he's smoking a cigarette and just leaning against the wall. Ugh, because I know these are fictional characters. Okay? Duh, I'm chasing whimsy here. This is a thought experiment. A thought experiment. And yeah, I thought that was a funny scene too in Strike Back. I like the little hand motions he was doing. Ben Affleck is as capable a comic actor as he is a serious actor and a director. But don't kid me, okay? Don't demean what I'm doing with that. I know it's fake. Uh, but the ways in which we can graft fact onto the fiction to make the fiction broader, heftier, meatier, more filling, I say that's great. And speaking of fact, we need to get to the second more serious caveat. This film and the research that I did that built upon it touches upon fascism, upon Nazism. And there is, while this film is comic, we both must acknowledge that there is nothing funny about fascism or Nazism, not a bit. Second of all,
Nope.
and this must be made clear, I do not support Nazism or fascism in any sort, nor am I trying to advance it, nor are you for that matter,
Nope.
and
No
neither
one
is
here
Kevin.
is either. No one here at the Triple
Neither
C
is
is. Neither are you. These are, again, fictional characters.
characters. It's a thought experiment,
Mhm.
uh, and neither is Kevin. He had a certain interest in the period, or why would the references to it keep turning up, including in Tusk? The Not Dash C Party is the name of the podcast. We have better taste than that here at the Triple C community. Um, and all of that was really just to uh, lead to a payoff in which the law enforcement hangs up on people when they're trying to get help. Um, it's perfectly fine to have an interest in the period because there are an incredible amount of lessons to be learned there. And
Right?
there are lessons that need to be known, particularly now, but at all times, for all periods, for all reasons.
Otherwise, we're going to be forced to repeat them. If you don't look at history, you'll be forced to. History will be forced to be repeated. And
You, you quote George Santayana there. The truth is that history may or may not repeat, but it certainly rhymes.
oh,
And we're learning that as well on our own skins. Um, and we will get into this again when we get to a certain point in this. But it needs to be said. I'm not a fasci. You're not a fasci. Neither is Kevin.
nope.
Nor, despite all the amount of research I'm bringing into this, am I an accredited historian. And anything I say can be overwritten at any point by an accredited historian or a layman who's more well read than I am. Um, I've had an interest in the period for some time, yes. In the personalities involved for some time, yes. One can fall down an extraordinary number of rabbit holes that way. But in the end, the practical purpose was the effect that it had, the value it had, was that I was able to recognize the next incarnation when it came and to say no to that. To recognize that there was no real substantive difference between the red armband and the red baseball cap.
Right?
So, just to let everyone know where I stand before getting into the weeds here, and there will be weeds. Um, so, how do I even do this? How do I chase whimsy here? You start by taking everything the film has to say about Andronicus Arcane at the start, arrange them in something like chronological order, and that's not hard because there isn't a huge amount of that given in proportion to the rest of the film. And that's okay. people who write novelizations or comic adaptations of film or create extended universes out of a film, they have to deal with this all the time, and it can be a bitch of a job wringing something out of what's relatively thin material. But I've damn done it strictly by taking what the film specifically says, working out the logic behind those points that the film says. If this, then that. If that, then this. And so on. And eventually, you do achieve a certain level of substance that you wouldn't otherwise. So, having said all that, and I'll bring up the notes because there's no other way I can do this. Are you ready, sir?
I'm ready. I'm
And
ready.
for my many. And again, please feel free to interject. Otherwise, my throat will die.
Of course.
And because it is still your show. Okay. Point one. Andronicus are right out of the gate, I trip. Point one. Andronicus Arcane is not his birth name, but an assumed name. Because it's not remotely German sounding. I have a name for the character in mind that I think is appropriate, but that's between me and Kevin. Um, we're assuming that he died at the age of 50, the character. Yeah, spoilers. He dies in the film. Why? Well, Ralph Garman, who played the character, turned 50 during the production. We're assuming the character went into hibernation in early May 1945 when he would have been 49. We're assuming the cryogenic chamber completely arrested his aging so that he was still physically 49 when revived. That he would have been killed during the events of the film before he hit his 51st birthday, but his 50th would have come in late 2014, even though he would have been aged about 120, chronologically speaking. Uh, three, Arcane's birth date that I'm conjecturing was November 17th, 1894. Why? Simple arbitrary whimsy. Ralph Garman was born on November 17th, and giving characters, even villain characters, birth dates of the people who played them or who co-created them is not new.
No,
The
long
character,
history of that. Long
yeah,
history.
the character of Ernst Stavro Blofeld in the James Bond stories was given Ian Fleming's own birth date, May 21st, 1908. Did you know that the character of Palpatine, at least in the Legends extended universe, was given the in-universe equivalent of Ian McDiarmid's birth date, August 11th?
That's so awesome.
So why not do that here? You know, there's no reason not to. And again, we're chasing whimsy. You have to have something. Number four, as the film makes clear, Arcane was born in Berlin. And as he says, Ja, Fräuleins, I am from Berlin. This is why I have an accent that sounds both scary and creepy. You're,
So
you're gonna
good.
get some impressions on this because I too know how to do English and do voices, but not by watching every single thing on Netflix. I already
Nice.
was able to do that. Also, Arcane was called the man from Berlin. What does that
Yeah.
mean? Was he born in Berlin? Was he born elsewhere but moved to and lived in Berlin? Was it that he was answerable to, took orders from Berlin? We'll get to that. But it seems the most interesting thing for a story is to have all three of those be correct. Point five. Arcane was born into the noble class, into the nobility. There's many reasons I say this. First and foremost, that the film gives me is that his costume when he's interacting with the Collines and Guy Lapointe
Mhm.
is it looks equal parts Hugh Hefner and Count Dracula. And I like that about it. And it
You're not
seemed
wrong. It really
no,
does.
the children of the night, what sweet music they make. And it just struck me that way. Uh, though that costume is appropriate to an eccentric or a noble or both. Why not be both? Also, he would have needed money to afford attempting a sculpting career and then to afford to go to university to become a scientist. You either have to be the rich corporate class or you have to be the son of someone wealthy. Uh,
Fair.
the best explanation, the most interesting, is he came from the nobility with generational wealth behind him.
Yeah.
What's the most interesting way to tell a story? That he was a noble in this case. This probably also means he had a von in his original German name, and I've allowed for that. Um, Point six, Arcane was a Catholic. Um, why? Multiple reasons. Kevin Smith, the creator of the character, is Catholic. Write what you know, right? As Mark Twain once said. I don't know
Right.
whether he's practicing Catholic. I haven't asked him. Um, I myself am no better than a freelance monotheist. So I'm talking out of school somewhat. I'm talking about things I don't know.
I'm a
Also,
Catholic.
well, okay. Then you can vet this, at least to a point.
I've got us covered for this. I've got the
Cool well, cool well. Also, consider that Arcane was inserted into Adrien Arcand's movement, the PNSC, later the NUPC, which is a
right.
predominantly Catholic movement from a predominantly Catholic Quebec. That needs to be acknowledged. Also, this is something you probably would have noticed in the score, the presence of the Dies Irae in the score. Um, this is a Catholic liturgical sequence. It's set to music as part of the traditional Requiem service with a Gregorian setting dating all the way to the 13th century. Uh, it's basically about the day of judgment when all souls are either saved or condemned to everlasting flames. And the relevant passage goes, Dies irae, dies illa, solvet seclum in favilla. Day of wrath, that day will dissolve the world in ashes. Now, you've seen the piece appear in other film scores, particularly Kubrick's adaptation of Stephen King's The Shining, the music done by Wendy Carlos. But you've got to have noticed that the Dies Irae as a leitmotif appears at least 5 times in the score. It stalks the score. Dun, 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 dun,
Mm-hmm.
dun, 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 dun. And it has the sense of being Arcane's personal motif in the score. I conjecture that he probably heard that in services when he was young, probably during a funeral, but that's between me and Kevin. Um, but the prevalence of this piece in the score hints that this idea formed a critical component of Arcane's thinking, particularly while he was a proxy serial murderer. But we'll get to that. Interestingly, Berlin and northern Germany were predominantly Protestant, while southern Germany was predominantly Catholic, though there was and is a significantly sized Catholic population in Berlin, and there's more than one Catholic church there. See what I mean about pursuing things and getting into the weeds and doing so?
Right. Chasing
Uh,
whimsy.
yep. But you're seeing there that there's some meat here on this bone. Point seven. Even as a child, Arcane would have displayed genius level intelligence, and I mean early childhood. Uh, he would have displayed a very keen interest in both the arts and the sciences. He obviously gravitated more passionately towards the arts, with an emphasis on sculpting, because he says, so, even though making clones was my life's work, it wasn't my passion. Uh, his passion was art, but he was equally capable in both, or why would he have been able to go be a scientist? Um, he would have demonstrated a clear talent for singing and impressions, even as a child. Ralph Garman is a great impressionist and a very capable singer. And again, it's appropriate to honor the man playing the character whenever possible in ways that don't compromise Ralph the man by connecting him too closely to a murderer he happened to play. It's not
Oh
his
yeah.
first murderer villain or, what is Red
Right.
State. He was chilling in that.
Right. And then I mean Kilroy is here. He's also a pretty disturbing character in that. But I mean, Kevin has even said about this third act for Yoga Hosers is like meant to be like a showcase for Ralph and everything that he's able to do.
He
Uh,
deserves it because he's an incredibly talented man. And I'm not just saying
Absolutely.
this because he made the patient zero decision that put me on the map. His talent is there because it is obviously there.
Yep.
And I note it for that reason. Hopefully, he'll get some kind of kick out of what we're doing too.
I hope that'd be
Speaking,
awesome.
hopefully, also speaking of his education, Arcane would have been able to speak German and French fluently. He would later speak English, of course, along with some Latin and Greek. German would have been his native language, of course. He's the man from Berlin. He would have had to speak French fluently, albeit probably with a thick German accent, just as he could later speak English. He'd had to in order to function in predominantly French-speaking Quebec. Um,
Okay.
he'd have to have a certain amount of knowledge of Latin and Greek because it would have been appropriate for a classical education of a student of his intelligence at the time, particularly if he'd had a private tutor, which is what I suspect. Um, the fact that his adopted name was Andronicus Arcane hints at a knowledge of Latin and Greek. We'll get to whether he picked it or whether that was given to him, but think about it in terms of looking at the definitions of those names. Andronikos, ancient Greek, victor, warrior, the male way of looking at those terms. Arcanus, Latin, meaning hidden, secret, understood by a few, obscure, mysterious, requiring secret or mysterious knowledge to understand, extremely old, e.g., interpretation or knowledge, possibly irrelevant. All of this applies to the character. Enigmatic, esoteric, recondite, clandestine. He is the secret warrior, the man underground, old, hidden from the world, possibly irrelevant. We'll get to that.
Hmm.
Speaking of point eight, he would have had an education appropriate to a character of his intelligence. He would have undergone primary education around 1901 to 1905, if we're assuming he was born in 1894 or so. Did he go to primary school or Grundschule, or was he given private tutoring instead? I think the latter. He would have undergone secondary or higher education circa about 1905 to 1914. This is the equivalent of high school, gymnasium, which is the one you go to if you're going to end up in the trades later.
Oh, okay.
Okay, here's a big one, and one that has a certain amount of personal relevance to me. Point nine, Arcane was a Wagner enthusiast. Arcane is seen listening to the prelude act one of the opera Tannhäuser in the stronghold while he's waiting for Guy Lapointe and the Collines to wake up. What was the sound system like in that stronghold, anyways? Um,
I don't know.
now,
Interesting though.
I don't know how acquainted with Grand Opera you are. I was acquainted with it from the age of 17 onwards, and it had a hand in my not being a band person, but rather an orchestra person.
Okay.
Um, my Here's a thing I've long tossed around in my head. There are a lot of possible Wagner pieces that Kevin could have chosen to convey Arcane's sense of grandiosity, which he
Hmm.
does have. Wagner appeals to people with a sense of grandiosity. But my personal theory is that he chose Tannhäuser because it was the piece that Bugs Bunny rode the big fat horse down the hillside to in the classic 1957 Warner Brothers cartoon, What's Opera Doc? And I have no idea if that's the case because I've raised this question with Kevin, but I haven't gotten an answer because he's a very busy man, but I know I'm right. It could have been anything. He picked that. I'm certain it was deliberate. Now, because Wagner appeals to grandiosity, using the work of Wagner is a quick and dirty way to connect Arcane with Hitler himself. It's a matter of record. Hitler was an ardent Wagnerian as early as 1904, 1906, when he was a teenager. If you want to learn about all of that, the work of historian Frederick Spotts is available. He wrote two books on the subject, and they're very engaging reads. I myself got into Wagner when I was 17, and the first piece I ever heard, Tannhäuser. ironically enough. Uh, Also, yes, let's talk about Wagner the man. He was an ugly man. He was a raging anti-Semite. His views were hideous. If you ever read Wagner's paper, Judaism in Music, you'll feel like you need a shower afterward. He should burn in hell for that alone.
Yeah, he's a pretty awful person. There's
Yeah.
no question about that. Pretty awful person.
And he attracted awful people. Hitler found validation in Wagner's anti Semitism, even though Wagner was dead by the time Hitler was born. And a lot of German nationalists did the same. But what did Arcane think of these views? Because, as we'll get into later, the film doesn't really touch on Arcane's views about Jews. The subject is left up in the air. Um, Now, getting back to him being an enthusiast, if Arcane liked one Wagner opera, he probably liked most or all of them. He could quote from them or identify passages from them with very little effort. Any decent Wagnerian, I assure you, could quote freely from Wagner. This or that passage could conjure up this or that piece. The way we quote freely from Star Wars or any other IP we grew up with, or Kevin's
Hmm.
films themselves. I'm not even supposed to be here today. Which operas were Arcane's favorites? We don't know. We can assume Tannhäuser was one, but were there others? I have reasons to assume he loved both The Ring Cycle and Parsifal, but that's between me and Kevin. Now, we're getting into Arcane as a late teenager, 1914. He would have been 18 in that year, would have turned 19 that year, which means Arcane, point 10, served in the First World War. There was no way he could have avoided it, assuming he was from a proud, noble family, a Prussian one at that. He was born in Berlin. It would have been more surprising if he didn't serve. In the
Yeah.
end, by the end of that 4 year war, everybody in Germany served one way or another. There was no way he was going to avoid that. And it's never mentioned, obviously, in the film. But it turns up as there's evidence of it that turns up. Uh, in his sculptures, I say. Point 11, by the way. Arcane tried to become a sculptor after serving in the war.
Yep.
We all know that. He would have been a capable sketch artist, also, I conjecture, in order to prepare for sculpting. A lot of sculptors are, meaning he was able in more than one artistic medium, than that he could draw and sketch as well as sculpt. He just gravitated to sculpture. He didn't just attack the marble without any plan. He'd chip a marble until it was beautiful, you know? Um, he would have made several sculptures in his brief sculpting career, but let's talk about the one that we see in the film. Kevin told me he doesn't definitively remember who created that sculpture, but his best guess is that it was John Kretschmer, who worked as a production designer on Tusk. And it's an excellent piece. Um, I think that. I'll tell you why I think that in a moment. We can tell that Arcane's time as a sculptor was the happiest time in his life before
Yeah.
2014 to 15 when he resumed sculpting. Ugh. Because he says as much. So anyway, before I got into science and before the war and before the Nazi no goodniks took over my life, I was an artist, you know, and my art was sculpting, you know. I chip away at the marble until it's beautiful to me, you know, and I love being an artist. Um, but we need to get to one thing. I'm convinced, and you probably would be looking at the sculpture yourself, it shows evidence of wartime post traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It proves to me that his sculpting career came after his service in the First World War. If he sculpted like this before the war, that indicates that he was just a sick twist from minute one, from birth. But it's less interesting as a story if he was always sick and didn't transition from not sick to sick. Plus, as you know, war trauma functions as it did for millions of reality as a step in his path to being sick. It just makes good logical sense. He would have seen bodies strewn across no man's land. He would have seen bodies and skeletal parts used as construction tools to prop up the very trenches he would have been serving in. Is this a precursor to using human body parts as components in his Goli Golem sculpture? You tell me. I think it is. Now, in this, Arcane wouldn't have been any different from a number of real life artists who either served in or reacted to that war and who expressed their traumatic reaction to that war in their art. the paintings of Otto Dix, George Gross, the sketches and sculptures of Kitta Kollwitz, the poetry of Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, Rupert Brooke, the writings of Robert Graves. And of course, as we know, his sculpting career was cut short by critical backlash. I love being an artist, except for one thing. I'm talking about the goddamn critics, you know. They told me I had no talent. They told me I stink on ice. Now, there's got to be more to it than that. If we look at the society he's doing this in, if Arcane's work is revealing the bloody reality of the war he was in to a German population behind the lines that didn't want to hear about it, that, by the way, was in fact told nothing but good news about the war up until the very end, that's as valid a reason as any for the German critical arts community to give his work the thumbs down. And it's one that makes the most sense to me, especially in the period we're talking in. Thoughts on that? Any thoughts? No?
No, I like it's it's so interesting that like all of this is coming from that, like the historical aspects of it is very in depth on this. I my mind's kind of blown.
Hopefully, I'm not overwhelming you with stuff. But as you can tell, all of it does logically extend outward from what the film itself tells us. If this, then this, and if that, then that. Now we go to him being a scientist. Point 12, Arcane entered the scientists after he was forced to quit sculpting and he attained a medical degree. He probably did it in Berlin. I know where he would have attended it. Point 13, he became a scientist and he taught the sciences in Berlin. Maurice, the teacher at Terry Fox Prep, says that Arcane was a brilliant scientist from Berlin who was teaching at the University of Lachute in Quebec. That assumes Arcane would have had prior teacher experience in order to effectively assume the role of a university teacher in Quebec. He probably would have taught courses on biology and genetics, which are the most likely subjects to teach for someone who would get into cloning. Probably he did it at his alma mater in Berlin. Um, Again, all of this is logical, which indicates he had an interest in biology when he was a kid, even though he gravitated more towards art. Um, Now, this is relevant. He may also have lectured at what in real life was the infamous Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics. And he might have done that in front of leading German eugenicists. And his lectures there may have contributed to his being later selected to run a cloning program. Um, but that's a breach for us to get into the dark and evil parts of this, because point 14, Arcane discovered Adolf Hitler and became a member of the Nazi Party.
Yep.
That's when I found, Hitler. He found him. Uh, there, I'm obligated, because of the seriousness of the subject, to get into the weeds a little bit on how my logic went on that. Um, Keep in mind, Arcane is conjectured as being a man born in and living and working in Berlin in the north, as opposed to the birthplace of the Nazi Party in Munich in the south. A man with a university education from a conservative Catholic background who may or may not have voted at all in past elections or even had a pre-existing political stance. He probably would have had no reason to be familiar with the Nazis in the early days of the party. He might have read a mention of them in the papers after their failed Munich putsch in 1923 and then forgot about them as soon as they faded from the headlines because they all went to prison for that. They probably wouldn't have appeared on his radar again until 1926, when Joseph Goebbels came to Berlin and took charge of the party's agitation efforts there. After that, Arcane would have read about them in the Berlin papers, maybe even seen them in the streets on a semi-regular basis, because Goebbels wanted his campaigns to be seen and mentioned in the press. But that doesn't mean he would have seen them as a viable political force at that point. And the 1928 federal election gave the party only 12 seats in parliament. That wouldn't have helped him pay greater attention to the party. And yet we're conjecturing a moment where Arcane found Hitler in such a
Right.
way for that encounter to have been so impactful that what made him decide not only to vote for the party, but also join it. Now, when did this happen? He would have been prevented from extensive travel by his scientific work. So it would have had to have happened in Berlin and in the evening, probably, so as not to interfere with his work. It had to have happened between 1928 and 1930 for various reasons. If I get into those, we'll be here for another hour. But there are specific reasons based on what he is wearing, his insignia, that tell me that. Um, so it's got to be, and by the way, if they're giving him charge of a top secret cloning program later on in a faraway country with limited supervision, with broad discretion to act on his own, they wouldn't have done that if he wasn't trusted in the party.
Right.
Uh,
He's got to have some real backing, real confidence behind him. He's got to have a lot of trust there with the
exactly.
upper echelons.
Uh, which leads me to a point. The party placed great value on what they called the Alte Kämpfer, the old fighters or old guard, meaning those who were faithful to the party when the party was nothing. The apparent cutoff point being the 1930 federal elections when the party suddenly became the second largest party in parliament after being the ninth smallest. That was a sudden rise. After that, everybody had to take them seriously as a political force. So joining after that was no big thing. But if you joined before then, to them it meant it was out of genuine conviction, not opportunism. I mean, like, as if to say, yeah, sure, everybody wanted to be a part of us at that point, but where were you when we were nothing? That determines how we view you as loyal or not. So it has to be before 1930's federal election. The most logical point in time would have been if he had attended, for whatever reason, one of the 20 speeches Hitler gave in the 6 weeks leading up to that federal election. And the best one that meets these criteria would have been during Hitler's speech on September 10th before more than 16,000 spectators at the Berlin Sport Palace, of which we conjecture Arcane was one. I don't know what the specifics are of that speech. I haven't been able to find that out, but it was clearly enough to give Arcane a transcendent experience and sway him to join,
Yeah, he found
uh,
Hitler.
to become a dues paying member. He found Hitler. After which point, as Arcane says, the Nazi no goodniks took over my life. He was so enthusiastic after this that he formally joined it, became a dues paying member. And from there, as he said, he allowed the party and its subsequent work in science for the party to consume his life, to take it over. And he would only shake loose that malign influence decades later. We can assume he did vote for the party in that federal election only 4 days after this encounter.
Mhm.
And then he voted for it again in all subsequent elections between then and 34. Also, point 15, Arcane joined a party sub-organization. We know that because he's shown in several flashback scenes wearing a brown shirt and a dark brown tie beneath his white scientist's coat. Did you notice that?
Yeah.
Now, the color brown had deep significance in the party hierarchy and almost no significance outside of it. It had no significance to Adrien Arcand's Canadian Fascist Party. So it wasn't that. He was an OG NSDAP member. There's no other way to logic this out. Exactly which sub organization, I haven't been able to nail down. Um, the SA, or Sturmabteilung, the party's stormtroopers, were the ones that wore brown shirts with brown ties. But there's a certain amount of leeway there. And the author I mentioned that I talked to, who wrote the definitive book about the history of the brown shirt, personally assured me that there was some leeway. It's fucked up that I have had a conversation like that. Oh, mein life, I tell you,
That's awesome. That's so
mein
cool.
Leben. Now, the significance of the color brown in the party dates to the period of the government's ban on the party following the failed 1923 putsch. Um, in 1921, there was a large supply of surplus khaki denim shirts called Lettow shirts because they were meant for colonial troops in German East Africa during the First World War, commanded by a certain General von Lettow. The Austrians bought that surplus of shirts. And now in 1924, a certain Gerhard Roschbach, a former SA commander and a current militia commander, he was living in Austrian exile after the putsch. He discovered the shirts. He bought them for his own use by his own men, now operating as underground militia of their own. In 1925, the ban on the party and its organizations was lifted, and one of Rossbach's lieutenants, a certain Edmund Heines, took the brown shirt, designed one of his own, patented it, and that became the brown shirt that everyone knows about. Um,
Wow.
a little history lesson for you, but that's the sort of stuff I have had to look in just to be certain about all of this.
Yeah, that's super in depth. Wow. Didn't
Uh,
know that.
and I hope it's not boring. I'm trying like hell not to be. And I hope it's not too serious, but it's hard for me not to be serious. I'm built that way. My wife urged me not to be, but no, I'm not built that way. Um, Point 16, Arcane was a participant in Nazi party activities from 1930 to 34, but we don't know what those activities are. I have my own theories, but that's between me and Kevin.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Now we're getting to a point where we get to Arcane being sent to Quebec. Um, as I say, I have three books specifically about Arcane's Canadian fascist movement, and they told me a lot about the movement that Andronicus Arcane inserted himself into.
Right.
Um, but one line from the film uh, tells us something about why Arcane was in Canada. He didn't just go on his own recognizance. He wasn't there for his own purposes. He didn't discover Adrien Arcane by accident. He says, the Third Reich imprisoned me here, inside this Canadian subterranean stronghold. He specifies here that he wasn't in Canada and in that stronghold on behalf of Arcane or of his NUPC. He was there on behalf of the Nazi Party and or the German government.
Mm-hmm.
He was there on orders from Berlin, not Montreal. And his true purpose in going there from the beginning, I conjecture, to build a clone army that would conquer Canada and the United States of America. Hoorah.
Mm-hmm.
You better watch your ass, Ralph. I too can do voices. There, I'm keeping it funny. Are you happy, Yvette? I hope so. I have to make her happy. I'm married to her.
Always.
Yep. Now we get to real history again. Let me get some lemonade in me. Mm. Lemonade, that cool, refreshing drink. Conversation, like everything, must be lubricated, according to the Marquis de Sade. Um, Adrien Arcand, as the film says, was a racist, fascist, far-right leaning newspaper guy, a
Yeah.
press man, before he founded his own party. According to the records, Arcand got on the Nazis' radar in March 1932. This was during the German presidential election. Hitler ran against the incumbent Paul von Hindenburg. On election day in March 1932, Arcand published an article in his paper Le Miroir in which he fully supported Hitler's candidacy. This brought Arcand in Quebec to the attention of the Nazis in Germany for the first time. This was followed up in October 1932 when Arcand was visited by a certain Kurt Lüdecke in his Montreal residence. Lüdecke was a real life figure, a German nationalist and an international traveler, and a personal acquaintance of Hitler. He's there in America to establish new contacts in North America that are favorable to the party. Lüdecke had heard of Arcand. He traveled from New York to Montreal specifically to meet him. He was impressed, apparently, by Arcand and his movement, and from this point on, Arcand stayed on the party's radar. Um, this encounter is written about in the books I've consulted. They're sitting here, obviously. And I've managed to look at Lüdecke's own memoirs on the subject. They're brief when it comes to Arcand, but they are true. Now, Arcand established the Parti National Social Chrétien, the PNSC, or the Christian National Social Party, on February 22nd, 1934. And I conjecture that from that point on, certainly from mid 1934, when the Nazis had full control of state power in Germany, they decided that Arcand's fledgling fascist movement had reached a level where it would need closer observation. And, as Lydekker speculated, they could be used to serve the Nazis' larger goals. This is why I conjecture that the party sent Arcand to Quebec in 1934. He would have been about 39. He would have been a party member for several years at this point. This would have been a secret assignment by his superiors in the party or in the government. They were indistinguishable in 1934. Leave Germany, move to Quebec, establish a cover identity, then contact and infiltrate Arcand's PNSC and become a covert link between that party and the German government. Why? Because probably the Nazis believed that Arcand's party would be an effective front organization for Arcand to use to establish suitable cloning facilities with no one connecting his activities directly to the German government. Why Arcane? Why choose him? Because he could speak fluent French. He can function in a predominantly French-speaking Quebec that way. He was Catholic, so he was compatible with a predominantly Catholic PNSC. He had a scientific background, so he could both run the project with minimal supervision, and it would strengthen his planned cover identity as a science professor. He would have presumably passed the party's pseudo-scientific, i.e. bullshit, racial screenings, so he would have been deemed genetically appropriate for a project in which, recall, he'd be using his own DNA. I used my own DNA. We'll get to the rest of what he was using later. Also, if he was indeed a late member of the so-called Old Guard, his loyalty would have been beyond question, so he could be trusted to run his operation with broad autonomy and still follow orders from Berlin.
Yep.
He also presumably had no surviving family left, and he could have left his previous life behind with no difficulty. What happened to his family? I have theories on that, but that's between me and Kevin. So he went to Quebec. He assumed a cover identity as part of his assignment. This is when he would have presumably adopted the assumed name of Andronicus Arcane and abandoned his former identity. Shades of Jimmy McGill becoming Saul Goodman? You tell me. Did he choose the name himself, or was it chosen for him? I conjecture he chose it himself. It's just too eccentric to have been assigned to him by someone else. Unless that person was more eccentric than him. It's possible, but not likely. He moved to
Never
Berlin.
know.
Well, yeah. The party was filled with eccentrics and failed artists like him. But if we get into that subject, that'd be another distraction. Point 19. Arcane moved from Berlin to Quebec, established his cover identity. He became a teacher at the University of Lachute in Quebec. By the way, the town of Lachute is real. It's just over 50 miles from Montreal. It has several French and English language schools, but it apparently does not appear to have a university. But we'll assume the fictional version of this town has one, shall we? The fall semester would have begun in September 1934, so Arcane would have had to have been living in Quebec by then if he was to begin teaching by then. Point 20. Arcane settled into life of Quebec. What did Arcane really think of Canada? I mean, he called it my beloved adopted homeland of Canada. So he must have found life there to his liking. He possibly developed an interest in hockey because he later called his sculpture the Goalie Golem.
Yep.
The Goalie Golem, which had a comically large hockey stick and a huge, presumably hand-carved hockey mask. I myself don't really have an interest in hockey. We know Kevin does. Write about what you know. But that's a subject we'll have to get into at some point, Kevin and I. But it seems to have been another Chekhov's rifle on the wall thing. You know, you have to set it up if you're going to pay it off with a goalie golem.
Hockey's a lot of fun.
Mm,
Hockey's a lot of fun if you decide to get into it. It's a lot of fun.
I suppose I shall have to at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Point 21. Arcane established contact with the PNSC in 1934, September or soon after, we're conjecturing. It's got to be in 34 because the film implies that the party's founding was in the relatively recent past because the street rally scene, presumably set in Montreal, shows one banner, a flag, Arcand, no apparent other supporters, and only a few passers-by.
Mm-hmm.
The film shows that. That's when I found Adrian Arcand and the Canadian Nazis. If Arcane encountered Arcand in September, it would have been approximately 7 months after the party was founded. Now, Arcand is played by Haley Joel Osment in the film. As we note from his actual photographs, the real Arcand was actually rather gaunt, maybe even a little skeletal, looking a bit more like Peter Cushing than Haley Joel Osment, but Osment did
Mm-hmm.
a fantastic job of the role.
Absolutely.
As an aside, the street side harangue had a large illustrated poster, one with a lot of beavers in it,
Mm-hmm.
of course. Now, to me, that evokes the rather icky artwork of Philip Ruprecht, who had the professional name of Phipps. Ruprecht drew some crude and vile anti Semitic illustrations and cartoons for Julius Streicher's newspaper, Der Stürmer, and for the infamously ugly children's book, The Poison Mushroom. All of those are disgusting. That's why I wouldn't send you any reference images of that, even though they are available. Uh, they're disgusting. And this poster is meant to echo that sort of mentality.
Yeah.
It's something I could have theoretically done for Kevin, but only for Kevin. I would never I would never use my own abilities to further fascism. Period. Zero, no way.
Absolutely not.
But I would do it for Kevin because he's mocking fascism. We'll get to that. Point 22, Arcane participated in PNSC activities between 1934 and 38. What was his role? We know it would have been known in Canadian and other historical records because Ms. Maurice based her class lecture on what was available in those records. We know only that he joined the party, again, presumably on orders from Berlin. He worked his way into the party leadership. He became a close personal, though covert, confidant of Arcand. Uh, Maurice says Arcand took Andronicus Arcane under his wing. What does being taken under Arcand's wing mean? Were they friends or just allies of convenience? What we know for sure is that he would have maintained his teaching position at Le Chute. He would have adopted Canadian life. He would have publicly attended party meetings. He would have further ingratiated himself to Arcand personally, all while secretly reporting on the party's activities to his superiors in Berlin. He would also have done the same for uh, the NUPC when Arcand in July 1938 merged his PNSC with the Canadian Nationalist Party under William Whitaker and the Canadian Union of Fascists under Joseph Farr to form the National Unity Party of Canada, or NUPC. In, in a meeting in Toronto, a nationwide convention of all fascist parties in Canada, Arcand was confirmed as the party's new leader. Uh, a very polite way of saying Canadian Nazis, as Miss Maurice says. Um, Point 24. Arcane arranged the purchase of land in Winnipeg in 1939. Um, Now, for that, there's some actual historical background that we need to go back into. Why then in 1939? Why not sooner? Why not later? Um, there is a historical way to justify this in story. In terms of history, after Hitler violated the Munich Pact and occupied the rump of Czechoslovakia, and then began threatening Poland, Britain gave Poland an unconditional guarantee of military assistance. This was March 31st, 1939. From then on, Germany couldn't achieve its aims in regards of territory through bluff or intimidation. If he was going to move further, that meant war with France and Britain. If he was at war with Britain, that in turn meant war with Canada. And if Canada went to war against the Nazis in Europe, they would surely have to crack down on the NUPC and other sympathizers at home. And that would put the operations of all German agents in Canada in jeopardy. So I'm conjecturing the word would have come from Berlin as soon as Case White, the invasion of Poland, was scheduled. As slow as the NUPC's growth had been, if Arcane was to get started on a secret cloning facility, he had to do so then, now, before the Canadian government cracked down and closed off the possibility entirely by cutting off Arcane's possible resources. That's a reason that makes sense. Arcane probably selected the land himself. He found 100 acres of suitable land available in Winnipeg, the provincial capital of Manitoba, centered on a corner property where Wayne Street intersects with Portage Avenue, Route 85. Wayne Street is fictitious, Portage is real, and it's a major arterial route, one of the oldest roads in the city. The address, 22925 Wayne Street, is what I've conjectured. Why choose Winnipeg, so far from our con center of power in Quebec? Probably for that very reason. There were NUPC members in Winnipeg and in Manitoba, as I've said, as the film says, but it would otherwise avoid attention from the authorities and anti fascists focused on Quebec. Lapointe pulls out the actual paper, the land purchase agreement, signed in 1939 by the self-proclaimed Canadian Führer Adrien Arcand for 100 acres in Winnipeg. This probably would have been signed in April or May 1939. Arcane would have had Arcand sign it. Those two names are so similar, probably on purpose, to make the purchase to prevent attention from falling on Arcane, to avoid him getting into any more records and press attention or law enforcement attention than necessary.
Right.
Now, we're talking about a subterranean stronghold here, an underground base. This itself makes you ask questions that fill in the blanks of what the film applies. Arcane would have used the summer break at his university from May and September 39 to secretly oversee the initial stages of construction. The construction of this thing would have been a minor architectural feat in itself. Think about that. Nothing in fiction potentially approaches it except perhaps Gus Fring's underground meth super lab in Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. In real life, a close cousin might be the infamous Führer bunker itself that was built in Berlin, circa 43 to 44, only a few years after the fictitious date of construction for the stronghold, circa 39 to 40.
Right.
As such, we can use some details from these projects to fill out the broad strokes. Like the super lab, it would have involved a significant amount of excavation in or near a populated area without attracting the attention of the inhabitants, the locals, or law enforcement. The land would have had been secured so the laborers could work free from scrutiny from the outside. The loyalty and the secrecy of those laborers would have had to have been guaranteed. Maybe the companies contracted for the work had existing connections to the NUPC or were front organizations for it. Who's to say? Possibly that. The land would have had to have been excavated to a depth of at least 40 feet because the depth of the Great Dining Hall alone was 37 feet in a row.
Mm-hmm.
Several hundred loads encompassing several thousand cubic feet of dirt would have had to have been removed. They would have had to blast and remove rock if they went that deep, and all without disturbing the existing utility systems in the area, the plumbing. How high is the water table in Winnipeg? Because the city experiences regular flooding. We'll get into that. Would the construction crew have had to waterproof the structure to prevent flooding? By way of comparison, the Better Call Saul Fring Super Lab required 10 months of excavation and blasting just to reach a half completed state at the end of that series, requiring 200 pounds of high explosives, the removal of 120,000 cubic meters of dirt and rock, without disturbing anything on the surface in the middle of a city with a population of 1 million people. Yikes.
Yeah.
And all of it at the cost of approximately $8 million. And that's half finished. Now, If we mapped it out, the stronghold would have been a pretty expansive complex. All we saw was the great dining hall, and I conjecture that it was made to look as fancy as it was, uh, in case the NUPC needed a secret conference site in the area. Any reason would have done. They obviously shot that at some location. They didn't build a set for that. But it's something out of Ken Adam and his designs for James Bond secret lairs for villains. Um, the list of individual rooms in the stronghold, it's can never be complete, but we can guess at some of them. There was the great dining hall itself, of course, that we saw a lot of. It had the primary exit, the staircase leading to the back room of the A to Z, and the secondary exit, a ladder leading to a hidden hatch, presumably. The cloning laboratory would have been its own room, equipped with a state of the art for 1940 cloning and incubation equipment. Uh, and it would have been a room of pretty big size in real life. And the flashbacks make clear that there was also a highly advanced for 1940 and presumably prototype cryogenic chamber, which just happened to look like a vintage refrigerator, but that's neither fish nor fowl. There would have been a generator room because a generator was mentioned. It would have, I mean, the thing was clearly drawing power from the surface, from the store up above, but there would have been a state of the art for 1940 main power generator and a backup generator and a ventilation system. There would have been a kitchen for Arcane to prepare his meals. There would have been a storage room for equipment or food. Several years of shelf stable rations, probably. You never know. You had to be prepared. There would have been a private bedroom suite, a private bathroom, unless he used the bathroom in the toilet in the secret passageway to relieve himself or wash his face. Somehow I doubt it. Um, and on top the completed stronghold, they would have constructed this local store, a small and unassuming structure, reached through a secret passageway in the bathroom, built on a track to draw the toilet into the wall, creating an opening. You could control the entrance from either side, it seems. Um, all of the excavation for the stronghold could have been explained by the fact that there was a store. You could explain it to outsiders as being for the installation of gas tanks for a filling station that, for some reason, that any reason would do, was ultimately not installed. It would have to have been a convenience store because otherwise, you know, they would have completely bulldozed and rebuilt a store on the old structure when the A to Z showed up. It would have had to have been owned or operated by an NUPC local loyalist because that would have been the best way to ensure a stronghold wasn't discovered. As I
Right.
said, Winnipeg would have had a number of loyalists that could have done it. What's one more fictional one? Point 26. Arcane fled Quebec in 1940. Uh, Ms. Maurice makes that clear in her lecture at Terry Fox Prep. Um, Poof, he just disappeared. Um,
Mhm.
and just as with talking about the construction of the stronghold, we can contextualize this by using actual history because the further we get in time at this point, the more events in Canada are in reaction to events in the wider world, to the war specifically. Um, from the moment that the Second World War began in September 1939, Adrien Arcand and his party kind of had to start working on the down low, but he can't help himself. He's still a committed fascist. He's still going to do fascist gonna fash, and that
Right.
began to annoy even further the Canadian authorities that were already hating his guts, justly so. Um, but events in the wider world finally forced the Canadian government's hand. Um, to start with, in April 1940, German forces invaded and occupied Denmark and Norway with the help of fascist elements in those countries. So I'm thinking primarily of Vidkun Quisling, uh, which made Quisling itself, the name, into another synonym for the word traitor. You can look him up. He's a piece of shit. Now, knowing that the much larger offensive in the West against France was imminent at that point, and as we said, anticipating a Canadian crackdown on the NUPC, we can conjecture that the German government would have ordered Arcane to clear out and withdraw to Winnipeg to avoid the arrest of their asset there. That would have made the most sense, especially when we go into the roundup of Arcane and his men. Arcane would have finished teaching at Lachute for the winter semester in April 1940. We conjecture, obviously, it would have been a last semester there. He would vanish before the fall semester began in September. Now, then, speaking of the Western offensive, on May 10th, 1940, the German forces launched that massive offensive in the West, invading Holland and Belgium and the Netherlands and northern France. Now, this caused a great deal of popular freakout in Canada for good reason, both against Germany and against those collaborators and subversive elements who were like Quisling in Norway, who were helping facilitate these victories. Now, the first Canadian soldiers were going overseas at this point. War hysteria at home was climbing. There were fears of a fifth column in Canada, just like Quisling's movement. Private organizations and municipal and provincial governments were all calling for the Canadian government to crack down and lock up all enemy aliens and Nazi sympathizers. There were Canadian veterans organizations that had to be held back from forming vigilante groups to take the law into their own hands. That's the environment in which we enter this. The trigger for the Canadian government was when their cousins in Britain arrested Oswald Mosley and his British fascist leadership. This was May 23rd, 1940. That same day, the Canadian government acted against Arcand. The RMCP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and local Montreal police, they raided party headquarters and the private homes of 7 suspected fascists. They seized 6 truckloads worth of swastika banners, maps, anti-Semitic German propaganda, and party membership lists. It took 6 hours or so to fill all those trucks with all of that crap. They hit the jackpot. Then, not long after, on May 30th, Canadian authorities rounded up the NUPC leadership itself. Adrien Arcand was arrested by the Sûreté de Quebec, just as Miss Maurice said, on May 30th, while he was on a fishing trip in the Laurentians with his party treasurer, Noël Descartes. And just as Miss Maurice said, Arcand was locked up as a security threat under the War Measures Act. In all, they arrested 11 fascists in Montreal, Ottawa, and Toronto. But point 27, Arcane evaded capture and disappeared. He was already gone by the time the roundup took place, right? The authorities probably would have looked for him at his home, at his office, and elsewhere on the university campus, which doesn't really exist, but they obviously didn't find him. So, and just as Miss Maurice said, Andronicus Arcane, he was never found. Poof, he just disappeared. As far as they are concerned and the historical records that Ms. Maurice is working from are concerned, Arcane was never seen again. He was probably listed as missing, and he would have been declared legally dead after a few years without being seen by anyone. So much for that. Point 28. This means Arcane lived almost entirely in the subterranean stronghold between 1941 and 45. We assume that the stronghold would have been completed by then. He would have been under orders to stay there, to literally stay underground and not interact with anybody except perhaps the sympathizer running the store up above, who might have hooked him up with newspapers and things. He would have tracked the course of the war from the stronghold via those newspapers, radio, shortwave reports from Berlin. He would have been a spy, so he would have had a shortwave on a specific frequency to receive updates and orders from Berlin, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, as he's tracking the war, keep in mind, he would have gone into hiding at the height of German success in the war, the defeat of France, its traditional rival. So his mood at that time probably was pretty euphoric. Um, if he served in the First World War, he probably would have had reason to be happy that they took care of France in 6 weeks when they couldn't do it in 4 years prior. Uh, he would have then seen the Battle of Britain unfold. Would he have wondered at the fact that Britain was able to beat off Germany in the air and prevent a land invasion? Would that have made him start asking questions? He would have seen the German invasion of the Soviet Union. He would have seen it sputter out just before it reached Moscow. Would he have begun to doubt his cause then? By which I'm asking, at what point would Arcane have begun to doubt that Germany would win the war? What point would he have doubted Hitler's leadership abilities? We're talking about the man he followed loyally for about a decade at this point, the man he found.
Right.
So was it when he lost at Stalingrad? Was it when it lost at El Alamein? Was it when America was drawn into the war by Pearl Harbor and Hitler foolishly declared war on the United States when he had no treaty obligation to do so? And what would the effect of seeing the battle lines first expand and then contract around Germany from 1943 onward would have had it on Arcane's mental state? What did he think about Kursk, about Normandy, about the Bulge, about the Allied lines hitting Germany's borders and then penetrating them? He would already have been gradually increasingly suffering from the psychological effects of isolation. He would have come to regard the stronghold as a prison. The Third Reich imprisoned me here, inside this Canadian subterranean stronghold, remember. Not because he was a criminal. They weren't imprisoning him for that reason. They had a lot more efficient ways to deal with criminals, but it would become an effective prison to him from that point on. He would have had, keep in mind, almost no one to talk to. He would have had only his Wagnerian operas and the voices in his head for company. He would have had a lot of time to waste until the order came in from Berlin to actually start on the cloning project. And until then, all he had to do was just order the stronghold to his liking and otherwise stay out of sight. Which brings us to the clones. Now, point 29. Arcane probably got started on the initial stage of the cloning project around late 1944. Why then and not earlier? Also, what good could the clones do for the German war effort in 1944 to 45 when defeat was pretty certain to pretty much everyone except perhaps Hitler himself? Especially the clones were supposed to take 100 years to incubate. What good were they going to do if they weren't going to be ready before the year 2045? That makes no sense. I had to find a way to make it make sense. Also, was there no way to accelerate the process so that it took less than 100 years? Or was that just the best that fictitious cloning technology produced by the Germans was capable of then? Was that the state of the art? I mean, an actual human being only takes 40 weeks to gestate. They needed 100 years? And why then, as I ask, something had to motivate Berlin to pull the trigger and send orders to Arcane, formally begin work on the clones, prepare them for incubation. But what could that be? I had to think of a real life reason, one that fits in with actual history. Even though these are fictional characters, keep in mind this is a thought experiment. And let me, folks, just let me. My personal conjecture is that the trigger was pulled when the newspapers published the essentials of a plan pushed forward by U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau. Other members of Roosevelt's cabinet resisted him getting it out there, but it got out there, and it called for the complete dismantling of German industry in the Saar and the Ruhr regions, and the reduction of Germany from an industrial to an agrarian country. We're going back to farming. The Morgenthau plan was never implemented. Roosevelt distanced himself from it. Morgenthau himself had very little say in the policy regarding post-war Germany. But because Morgenthau was Jewish, German anti-Semitic propaganda made a meal out of it. because they could now point to this plan and proclaim that the Allies sought the extermination of 40 million Germans. They were going to turn Germany into a giant potato patch. Uh, this is vile propaganda, and it was meant to spur the desperate German people into further and more fanatical resistance. Um, in reaction to this plan, we have to look into Hitler's distorted mind. That's not a pleasant place to be, not remotely. But if we're talking about coming up with a fictional reason for why, at that point, Hitler or his inner circle would order Arcane to whip up clones that wouldn't be ready for 100 years, we can only go there to find a reason that makes sense. I conjecture that Hitler himself began further developing ideas that had probably been gestating since Stalingrad. By then, he had failed as the great conqueror. And whether he admitted it on the surface or not, he, in his subconscious, probably knew it. He can't be a conqueror, but he could still be the great destroyer. For his ego would have demanded that if he was to be defeated, it had to be a defeat worthy of the great man of history that he viewed himself as, incorrectly, of course. He needed to attain immortality. If the whole world was destroyed, he needed that still. In his distorted mind, and he has been on record saying this, Germany had failed them. Let the Allies dance on his corpse. Let them conquer nothing but ashes. On the record, he said, I have no sympathy at all for them. They failed.
Right.
Now, the the clue that really allowed me to arrive at a reason fitting with that mindset was watching a 1973 film called Hitler: The Last 10 Days, which was about Hitler in the last 10 days of the bunker before he killed himself,
Yep.
starring Sir Alec Guinness in the role. And if you
Right.
don't know what weird is, you haven't known weird until you have watched OG Obi-Wan Kenobi made up to look like Hitler, and weirder still to deliver a credible performance in the role.
Alec
And
Guinness, one of the greats. One of the
right,
greats.
I mean, I'd rather hail him for his work with David Lean or, of course, Star Wars. But no, we're stuck with this, and I'm sorry, folks. Um, but he had a quote in the film, which he may or may not have said in real life, in reaction to when he learned that Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, was in fact talking behind his back to the Allies. He regarded that as a betrayal so bad that he had almost no betrayals left. And he knew the situation was pretty much fucked. And Hitler, played by Guinness, says, in 100 years' time, 100 years, remember, perhaps a great man will appear who may offer them the chance of salvation. He will take me as his model, use my ideas, and follow the course that I have charted. Turns out he didn't need to wait 100 years. He only needed to wait 70 or 80, but that's neither here nor there. Um, but
Right.
that coming man, that 100 years time, that fits into the need for clones ready in 100 years. This coming man would need strength in his hand. So this could be why Hitler could have decreed that the cloning operations should be stepped up. 100 years hence, the world would find itself facing his last and most spiteful post-war surprise, a force of genetically superior super soldiers spearheading a revived Nazi movement. Hitler was capable of that level of spite. We know this. This is a matter of history. It's a matter of the record.
Right. He absolutely was.
And I don't know if you've seen that film, or at the very least seen the more modern, more popular ones like Downfall. But if
Hmm.
that subject is intriguing, and it doesn't necessarily have to, those are good watches. Um, I also recommend The Empty Mirror, as I mentioned earlier, for a peek inside his incredibly distorted mind.
Yeah.
It's more of an art house film than anything else, though. It's not on plot. How many clones did Arcane produce, by the way? I counted the individual squishes in the fight scene with the Colleens in the store. I counted the clones in the stronghold with Arcane, and I added them together. And even being generous, I count at most 60 clones in the entire film.
Yep.
Now, by German military standards, that is only just above platoon strength. The Wehrmacht, 40 to 50 men, Waffen SS, 30 to 40. That's what a platoon was in those units. And that's less than half of company strength. Wehrmacht 150 to 200, Waffen SS 100 to 200. And by Canadian Army standards, that's roughly the equivalent of two platoons, each 35 men at most, but
Hmm.
still less than a company, 100 to 200. Now, I'm not an expert on militaries or paramilitaries, and I bet you aren't either. And
Not
I've
even
never
a little.
served myself. But I don't think you need to be an expert to see that 60 troops are nowhere near enough to conquer both Canada and the United States. I don't care how big they're supposed to get. I don't care whether they're made of bratwurst or human flesh or anything else.
Yeah.
Which leads me to a major theory I've had that I've left on the shelf up to now. If they wanted to really use a clone army to take and then hold Canadian US territory, there'd have to have been more secret cloning facilities spread across North America. How many? God only knows. 37? I don't know. In a row. But if the Nazis were using fascist parties abroad as cover to fund and construct these facilities, well, there were fascist parties just like Archons across North and South America, Western and Eastern Europe, even in parts of Asia. That's a lot of potential sites for cloning facilities. Would Arcane have known these other facilities existed? He sure wasn't acting like it. Plus, from a security standpoint, it's smarter to keep these sites compartmentalized from each other. That way, if one of these scientists, like Arcane, had actually been arrested, they would only lose one facility, not several or all of them.
Yeah.
Now, would each of these facilities have been operated by a pre-selected German mad scientist? And would each of those scientists have contributed their own DNA to their respective clone units? If Arcane is really a representative, then yeah, maybe. Why not? Also, here we come. Why bratwurst and sauerkraut as opposed to other materials? I used my own DNA and mixed it with the finest bratwurst and sauerkraut direct from Deutschland. Now, admittedly, this is where all my attempts to impose a serious tone on this thing fall flat.
Right. For all the history and all the pulling of the strings and seeing it all and like putting
It
it all
all
together.
comes it all comes crashing up against the concept of super soldiers made of sausage.
Hmm.
And as much thought as I've tried to put into this, there's no reconciling what I'm trying to do here with bratwurst commandos. There's no logical reason for these guys to be made of bratwurst because it's not about logic. They're made of sausage because the intended tone of Yoga Hosers was lighthearted, cartoonish, and my entire approach is decidedly not that. But we just have to go with it. We are
It's a yin and
constrained,
yang. It's a yin and
right?
yang.
We have no choice. This is what the movie says. It's the Bible as far as we're concerned. We got to go with it. Is it relevant that all the clones had Hitler's distinctive mustache when Arcane himself didn't wear a mustache?
Mm.
Did they have Hitler's own DNA? Was it sent to the stronghold from Germany along with the bratwurst and sauerkraut shipments? Are we in the boys from Brazil territory now? That's not a bad film, by the way. I mean, Gregory Peck not only chews the scenery, he swallows it whole and spits out the bones like an owl, but it's worth watching.
Right.
Um, Another question I've long pondered, what would the clones have looked like if the incubations hadn't been interrupted? If they had emerged in 2045 exactly as they were supposed to? The ones we got were compromised. Their bodies were stunted. They were shrunken to a mere foot in height. They were entirely unsuitable for purpose. What would they have looked like if they turned out right? Again, I have to turn to history, actually to art history, and some very sick theory in order to make this work in universe. I conjecture that originally they were meant to resemble the idea of what was called the new man, capital N, capital M. This is the
Mhm.
unattainable pseudo Nietzschean superhuman ideal, which was appropriated from the Olympians of Greece and Rome,
Right.
which was
Yeah.
true only in Nazi theorists' fucked up heads, and it was true only in the work of Nazi sculptors like Arno Brecker and Josef Torak. I need to send you an image of Brecker's foremost piece, a sculpture called Readiness, and it gives a perfect idea of what they would have looked like. And I sent you a sketch I made of what it would have looked like had the clones been viable.
Mm-hmm.
They would have been tall, very broad shouldered, with narrow hips. They'd be muscular, but in a way that's more aesthetic than functional. They'd be possibly nude, although I didn't sketch them that way. The sculptures of Brecco and Torak were nude because they were regarded as utterly immune to shame of their nakedness because of the purity of their souls. Excuse me. And keep in mind, Arcane began as a sculptor, and he might have been of the same aesthetic mindset, even though his sculpting medium at this point was bratwurst,
Right.
and would later be human flesh and bone. But that's a way of keeping it in the mindset. Um, what were the clones supposed to do had they been viable? They had to function as viable soldiers or commandos where they had been trained for this. I mean, was Arcane supposed to have trained them? He could train them later to find victims for him to use on the golem. So clearly they could take orders to a point. I mean, were they supposed to run drills to march? Would they have combat skills? Were they supposed to be capable of using weapons?
Mm-hmm.
Guns, grenades, projectile weapons like the Panzerfaust, or bladed weapons like knives or swords? Or they just use their bare hands? And if they were particularly large, did they have special equipment made in advance for them that was also large, that would be ready to use when they were ready? Are we talking about extra large helmets and uniforms and boots like I sketched out? Are we talking extra large weapons and guns and blades to fit extra large hands? And what would it have looked like when the clones were released in 2045 and set loose on the world? I mean, presumably they would have begun with Winnipeg itself, and then they would have spread out to surrounding Manitoba locations. What I'm imagining it would have looked like is some kind of cross between the scenes in Game of Thrones where the giant, is throwing people around or
Mm-hmm.
slamming them into the ground or literally ripping them apart. And that would have been mixed with, I don't know, the last half hour of Come and See, which is a film that depicts the German destruction of a village in Belarus in a sequence that's so grueling it makes the killing fields look like a Disney film. Now, that kind of image is horrible to contemplate when you take the premise seriously, and both Arcane and his superiors in Berlin must have known it would look something like that, but Alec Guinness's Hitler again lets you know what Hitler would have thought of it. Nature is cruel, so I too must be cruel. The lives of millions of mediocre, ordinary people are of no account. And of course, we all knew that's how he thought already, because the souls of 60 to 75 million dead in that war that he started bear witness to it.
Yeah.
Now, we should probably use this to take a moment to pull aside from all the funny and all the speculation and all the world building to raise a deadly serious point. Better lube my throat first. There is a point, Jim, at which this now often used trope of the Nazi mad science wizard itself becomes harmful. It's something that really wasn't talked about before the 1960s, and it really became popular in the 1980s because George Lucas got hold of a fringe book handed to him by his friend Philip Kaufman. And as I've said in the past, and I stand by that, Lucas is interested in fringe theories. Doesn't mean he believes in them, just that he thinks they'd make fascinating grist for stories. And it
Mm-hmm.
did. And that's why we have the Indiana Jones series now. But the problem with fiction making claims that the Nazis made more scientific advances than they really made, or carried out more archaeological expeditions than they really did, sought out ancient artifacts that they really didn't, did all these so-called cool things that they really didn't do, is that it risks making the Nazis themselves appear cool.
Right.
That's a problem. And
Big problem.
the danger from that is twofold. First, if the Nazis are made to appear cool when they really weren't, then that potentially could draw in young or uninformed minds and make them think that Nazism is something worth supporting when it's absolutely not.
No, losers support Nazis.
Yeah. Second, depicting the Nazis in this way risks insulting the victims of Nazism because it shoves the victims out of the
Yep.
center of our attention where they belong in favor of not only a sideshow, but a sideshow of a sideshow.
Yeah.
Because as you and I know, and as history knows, the Nazis didn't develop cloning. They didn't develop flying saucers or the bell, and they didn't have secret bases on the moon. Although films or books or video games or episodes of Ancient Aliens, for Christ's sakes, they have claimed all of these things and more. What the Nazis did do was launch the worst war in history, which killed more people than any war in history and devastated an entire continent, at the center of which was a terrible mass murder program that resulted in the creation of mass killing centers all over Europe, in which 6 million Jews and millions of other minorities and outgroups all died horribly, all at the direction of a sociopath and his sociopathic inner circle. And the fact that they were slightly ahead of other countries in developing rockets or jet planes doesn't obscure that tragedy and shouldn't be allowed to.
No.
Now, a caveat. Kevin was not remotely trying to glorify Nazis when he made Yoga Hosers.
No.
He was making a comedy. It was one that held up the Nazis as represented by Andronicus Arcane as ridiculous, pathetic losers, as you've said. And as anyone will tell you now, particularly when fascism is on the rise again, mockery, ridicule is a weapon against fascism, and it's very effective. And it's not designed to make fascists look cool. And if you think it does, you're approaching it from a distorted point of view, whoever you are. I don't mean you personally, Jim.
Right.
I mean, was Mel Brooks making the Nazis look cool when he was mocking them? Was Charlie Chaplin when he made his parody of the great dictator? Of course not. Neither was Kevin. And neither am I by engaging in this thought experiment, and neither are you by providing me a forum for it. But it's important in the middle of this thought experiment to pull over for a minute and acknowledge the reality created by the fascist villains that are being mocked here. Because even though these are fictional characters I'm analyzing here, or fictional versions of real historical figures in this case too, it's important to touch some grass and look at
Right.
the life and death reality of things, to acknowledge the stark facts on which the fiction and the thought experiment is built.
Yeah.
And I think we've done so now. And we're almost at the end of the second third of this. Point 30, Arcane went into hibernation in 1945. So in 1945, I initiated the 100-year-long incubation process. Now, again, a little history needs to be filled in, brought in to fill in the gaps here. To set the stage for this last act and this part of the drama, the Red Army was launching across the Oder in April 1945 and moving to encircle Berlin. Arcane's emotional state was already really low, would have had to have been, and would have plunged even further. This is Berlin. This is the city we say he was born in. With buildings and parks and streets he'd walked past times beyond count, populated by people he'd known. And now it was being overrun and devastated, leveled by Allied bombs and Russian shells. This had to have affected him. And he was a Wagnerian, remember, as we've said. He couldn't help himself, probably, in seeing things in operatic terms. Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods, where the gods perish in fire as Valhalla burns and as mortals bear witness. And now his superiors in Berlin are caught in a city in flames, while Arcane can only listen over the radio from a continent away, bearing witness. He was probably listening to recordings of the epic climax of Götterdämmerung, the opera, while waiting for further orders, listening to Valhalla burn down, while listening to news of Valhalla burning down. The turning point, I'd conjecture, would have been that just before the Red Army overran headquarters in Berlin, his superiors would have sent a coded radio message out on the special frequency used only by the strongholds, a command to initiate prearranged shutdown procedures. Prepare to go into hibernation. Now Arcane would know he was entirely on his own, so he would have carried out his orders. He'd shut down all non-essential systems in the stronghold to conserve power for the clone incubators and for the cryogenic chamber, of course. Then, I conjecture, he would have made the final decision at his discretion. Those would have been his orders, but he would have made the final decision on hearing an announcement, which really happened, via Hamburg radio, the last shortwave radio station, which was still on the air at that time. This is May 1st, 1945. It officially acknowledged that Hitler was dead in Berlin, and that Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz had been appointed as successor. Dönitz made a speech. It was filled with outright lies by claiming that Hitler died fighting bravely at the head of his troops. It didn't say that he actually both shot himself and took cyanide in the bunker. And Arcane, therefore, couldn't know this. But for him, it would have been the last straw. Now, there's no hope left for a German victory. It's time to start the Spike campaign. He followed his orders. He checked the clones to ensure they were functioning, that the equipment was functioning. Then he places himself in the refrigerator/cryogenic chamber, programmed to revive him in 2045. And he, as he says, and I put myself on ice in a cryogenic chamber. Time to wake up when my little wiener babies will full-grown clones. Ooh. Can't help myself. His orders on revival probably were these: ensure the clones had grown to full size and can function as soldiers. Ensure they're capable of responding to commands. And then release them to carry out terror operations in a pre-designated area encompassing Canada and the eastern United States. And that puts the end on that section of his story, the second third of it. The third third would have been about his serial murdering career as depicted in Yoga Hosers. Now, a couple events need to be covered in between. He goes into stasis in 1945. He comes out of it in 2014. In between those events, a couple of things happen. We need to talk about the 1950 Red River flood. Now, as I say, seasonal flooding is common in Winnipeg. There's two rivers that meet there, the Assiniboine and the Red River of the North. We are assuming that the crew that built the stronghold would have done all they could to protect it from flooding. And that probably was enough for the first 5 years. But in 1950, the Red River reached its highest level since 1861. 8 dikes gave way. 600 square miles of farmland became a lake on a day that Winnipeg would forever call Black Friday, May 5th, 1950. 4 of the city's 11 bridges were destroyed. 100,000 people were evacuated, the largest evacuation in Canada to date. 1 person died, property losses at more than $1 billion. Now, I'm saying that seepage from the flood could have affected the integrity of the stronghold and its systems, particularly its electrical systems. They'd worked to prevent floods that serious from ever happening again, and there would never be a flood that serious again. But it's too late for the stronghold. There would have been damage sustained, and further water damage during seasonal flooding would have just accumulated. And that cumulative damage would play a part, I think, in the electrical failure in 2014 that would prematurely revive Arcane and undo all his work. Second, in 1967, as Ms. Maurice says in her lecture, Adrien Arcand died. He was released from prison in 1945. His party was revived, but under different leadership. He ran 2 campaigns on his own, failed both times. He never wavered in his support of Hitler. He repeatedly downplayed the Holocaust, a piece of shit that he is, becoming a mentor to other Holocaust deniers. Ernst Zundel comes to mind. Even then, he's still promoting harm in the world, the piece of shit. He was declining physically as well as mentally. He had suffered severe kidney failure. He had cancer over his last years. Go cancer. It briefly went into remission, then it comes back with a vengeance, and he died in Notre Dame Hospital in Montreal on August 1st, 1967, and that's a death that few paid any attention to. Only loyalists went to his funeral, His grave was a simple granite plaque that, wasn't very impressive. Every year thereafter, a few people come to pay homage, but otherwise, the name of our Khan disappeared from history, which is why I didn't know about it until Yoga Hosers, even though I should have known about it. And one more thing that would happen. Remember how we were talking about how the convenience store would have been operated by a sympathizer of our Khan's to keep the stronghold a secret?
Yeah.
Let's assume he died. Let's assume it was old age that did it. Let's assume his family wasn't interested in running the store themselves. The store would have been sold to the corporation that owns the A to Z convenience store chain. Now, that chain's fictitious, so we have to speculate on a date for this, but it's worth noting that the first 7-Eleven opened in Winnipeg in March 1970. We can assume it's roughly around that time. And by the way, how many sevens are in Winnipeg today? I checked. 37. Yes, in a row.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Now, they would have presumably converted it to an A to Z without needing to rebuild the thing from the ground up, which is why the secret passage in the original store's bathroom was intact and undiscovered. But the transition guaranteed that when Arcane was revived, he'd have no support from the outside world. Which leads us to point 32. Arcane was prematurely revived in late March 2014. How I worked out the dates down to the month, that's something I'm not going to get into. But as Arcane says, 70 years later, the little Colleens would change everything simply by singing a song. And because Ika Dud, put too many plugs into the outlet, and as Tabitha, that character, says, they blew out the power with their amps. If we add the fact that all of the plugs were in one socket and to the water damage from repeated flooding events, yeah, the power system in the stronghold would have been vulnerable. Down goes the system. The stronghold's emergency backup generator would have kicked in almost immediately, but the damage would have been done. It would have only taken this brief interruption of power to the cloning lab to screw all things up. Point 33, Arcane discovered the cloning project had failed. The power outage in the A to Z that night shorted out my ancient Canadian subterranean generator. Ooh. And so, first, Arcane was woke up, so I woke up prematurely from my cryogenic slumber. This would have been 31 years premature. And of course, as he said, the incubation process had also been interrupted, forever stunting the growth of my wiener babies. My life's work was a failure. Ooh. Now, I conjecture that this would have been the beginning of what FBI profilers call a precipitating stressor that would lead to Arcane becoming a proxy serial killer. As part of my research, I looked into and read the memoirs of Special Agent John Douglas, who was the FBI's premier profiler of serial murderers for some time. He wrote this memoir called Mindhunter, and Netflix developed it into a series, as you probably know. Speaking of Netflix, and it's a fantastic show, but I maintain that it only scratches the surface of what's in that book. Now, point 34, Arcane re-educated himself between April and August of 2014. Because, as he says, he had freedom to move around now. The exit tunnel of my Canadian subterranean stronghold brought me to the back room of the A to Z, and one night after closing, I took my first steps into a brave new world. He was happy. He was free. He didn't know what year it was, probably. He didn't know whether he'd fallen off the radar of the authorities yet, so he probably didn't elect to venture any further out of the stronghold than the inside of the store. But he roamed freely around there, and he was apparently not discovered. So every night after the store closed, I would make myself at home in the A to Z back room, where I learned to speak English and do voices by watching every single thing on Netflix. I love that voice. It hurts the throat, but I love it. Um, think about what it says about how smart Arcane is. Mm. He learned to use a laptop. They're designed to be easy to use, but he learned to use one with no guidance whatsoever in a matter of days or weeks. It says a lot about how intelligent he is that he learned enough English, his third language after German and French, remember, to speak it quite competently after only a few months, albeit with a heavy German accent that sounds both scary and creepy. He learned to make voice impressions of English speaking actors. He was that good at English at that point. Now, we've covered the fact that he probably was good at impressions from early on. It's a natural talent, it's not one that you necessarily learn, it's instinctive. He watched one or more films starring Schwarzenegger, The Terminator, definitely, because he says, I'll be back. He watched one or more films starring Pacino, including Scent of a Woman. Otherwise, why do Ura? Um, he watched one or more films with Stallone. Certainly Rocky, because he says they cut me, Mick. Ed Wynn, of course. Oh my goodness, don't you know? And he watched the Batman TV series starring Adam West, because how could he possibly do that if he hadn't watched the series? Now, this is just the most current example, as I said, of his skill. And by the way, if he could access Netflix over the laptop, he probably also could access YouTube or Wikipedia, other services available. Um, he would have learned a great deal about the modern world. Uh, one last time of throwing history into this before getting into the true crime part of this and then closing off this whole discussion. Keep in mind, he went into hibernation expecting that Germany would become a completely devastated wasteland. He and his superiors anticipated that the Western Allies and the Soviets would fall out, the Cold War. They got that right, but they didn't anticipate the Marshall Plan, or the German economic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder, or the rearmament of West Germany and its membership in NATO, or the European Union. They anticipated German partition, but not its reunification in 1990. Furthermore, Arcane was from Berlin. He would have barely recognized Berlin today. I mean, he would have recognized some of the features that he'd known in his lifetime. The Brandenburg Gate would have still been there, as it had been for centuries, but the buildings around it are quite different. The Reichstag building, the parliament, it had been there all his life. It's still there, but it's now topped by a very modern glass dome designed by Sir Norman Foster, which was meant to symbolize transparency in government. And the interior would have been completely gutted and completely rebuilt in modern terms and completely unrecognizable to him. It almost would have been a foreign city. And the closest analog I would have, Jim, is to compare images of San Francisco today to images of the same city in Star Trek. Right?
Okay. Yeah.
The basic lines of the city are the same, but it's now filled with modern towers of steel and glass. The Golden Gate Bridge is still there, but depending on which trek you're watching, there's either a tram line on it or a series of solar panels.
Yeah.
It's there, but not there. Recognizable, but completely unrecognizable. And in the larger picture, Arcane would have seen a Germany and a world that is getting along just fine without Hitler and his Nazi movement, thank you very much, and which correctly damns Hitler and the Nazis as criminals, as mass murderers, as the villains and losers of history, just as you and I are determined to make certain that we remember they're framed as. It would have finally hit Arcane in his brain. He would have realized he'd spent the majority of his life on a losing cause. He'd wasted his life supporting a failed movement by engaging in a failed cloning experiment that wasn't needed. He would have had to do a lot of soul searching at that point about whether he'd been right to join and support the Nazi Party to begin with. He clearly decided to give it up because he said, so I didn't want to be a Nazi for the rest of my life. Now, he said that before he's shown emerging into the store and watching Netflix. All of that Netflix could have just reaffirmed his initial instinct. Keep in mind, he's wearing his brown shirt and insignia of the party still at that point. but he never wears it after that point. He gets rid of it and adopts the Hugh Hefner Count Dracula civilian garb, for lack of a better term. So that's when we know he's completely given up this Nazi bullshit. And so we will. Um, he remained a Wagner enthusiast because he's still listening to Tannhäuser. But otherwise he gives it up. Instead, as he says, I discovered that this modern world worships popular arts and entertainment. He would have toured the store after closing. He would have discovered the magazine rack. And I'm guessing that Them Weekly magazine was likely one of the first publications he picked up, maybe the first. And this completely changes and reboots his thinking. He doesn't have to be a Nazi anymore. He doesn't have to be a scientist anymore. He doesn't have to be anything except what he in his core has always wanted to be, an artist. So, point 35, he begins planning his return to the arts. Point 36, he has this epiphany, one that directly leads to becoming a proxy serial murderer, unfortunately, because keep in mind, he is still consumed by grandiosity, by hate and resentment, but he has nothing left to vent that on. His family is gone. His superiors in Berlin are gone. The critics who rejected his work in Germany, dead and gone. He can't focus his hatred on himself for making all the wrong choices in his life because that'd be too much for his ego to handle. And just like some egotistical people that we know in modern times, okay, he would have completely ignored that and say, everything's fine, okay? If Godzilla were in the streets, he'd say, there's not a huge monster running around the streets, okay? So he couldn't accept his own failure entirely. He'd just acknowledge and move on. He'd have to find someone new and familiar at the same time to focus his hate on. Because there are still critics out there. I'm talking about the goddamn critics, you know? He'd learned the hard way the last time he tried to be a sculptor, that if he premiered something new, the current critical community might again try to block him. This time he'd be ready for that. He understood this time he didn't need the acceptance of the critical community to succeed as an artist. And it's true, you don't. I respect their opinions myself, but I didn't come to prominence that way. Instead, he could rise to prominence outside of that by using the popular press and media. More people paid attention to the articles in Them Weekly magazine than to the arts reviews in so-called respectable publications. So this is when I conjecture, the concept of the dies irae that we brought up early in this would have come back. The day of wrath, this time his wrath, which would be visited on the proxies of those who had once wronged him, the Canadian critics substituting for the German critics. It would be a twofold plan because he talks about phase 2 of his master plan and he doesn't get to a third one. Phase 1 is this. He would humiliate the critics, the respectable critics, by doing an end run around them. His sculpture would be celebrated. He would be celebrated without them. He would prove them unnecessary and make them acknowledge it. That's the first phase. And we'll get to the second phase when we get to it. Suffice it to say, he found a new use for the failed clones, the Wiener babies. They're obviously too small and delicate to kill critics themselves, but they could still serve him by acquiring the raw materials he needs to assemble his new sculpture. Then they could effectively pilot it. Then we get to phase 2. The critics that he declared as enemies would be shamed, and then they would be judged in dies irae, the day of wrath, his wrath. They would be slaughtered by his very sculpture. Like the real judgment day of the Bible, those who would were lost would be judged, cast down, sent to everlasting perdition, not by the sword of an archangel, but by the big hockey stick of his creation. That's a good way to contextualize Arcane's murder plot in a way that makes sense and that takes all advantages of Chekhov's gun. That's an old rule in stories that say if you're going to fire a gun in Act Three, it needs to be seen on the wall in Act One. Have you heard of that?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. And if that you're going to have it on the wall in Act One, you have to fire it in Act Three. Point 37 in a row.
Mm-hmm.
Arcane began his proxy murder spree in August 2014. I'll get into why later, but it's a very small point. You see, girls, each night as I slaved away over my masterpiece, one dream fueled me. As we've covered, he would premiere his new sculpture, first in a long, long time, and he would humiliate the critics by doing an end run around them. As he says, the only thing I dreamed of for the past 6 months is looking at a photograph of me standing proudly next to my sculpture on the famous People Are Just Like You page of Them Weekly magazine. That's not easy to do, that voice. I credit Ralph for doing so well with it. All he needed was somebody to take the picture. All it would take is the right photograph of him standing not only proudly, but defiantly. He defied the critics, that is, you know. They'd chew infinitely on their resentment of him, just as he had of his resentment of them. It wouldn't matter. He would have beaten them. Victory. And he makes his sculpture. There's room for an interesting montage where he goes into art theory as he assembles this thing. Would have been gory and beautiful to look at the same time. Uh, Keep in mind, this is, as he says, it's a sculpture celebrating my beloved adopted home of Canada. I call it the Goalie Golem. The Golem, not the Gollum of Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. The Golem.
Mm-hmm.
The golem is a Jewish concept dating to the late 16th century, but with roots that are far older. So the question is, how did Arcane know about Jewish folklore to begin with? Did he know about the golem before going underground? Did he learn about it during his re-education? And all we know is that he called his sculpture the Goalie Golem. And why would he name his sculpture for something from Jewish folklore, particularly one that is often described as either protecting or avenging Jews? Because this touches upon one last historical question. What were Arcane's real feelings about Jews? The film leaves that almost entirely up in the air. All we could conjecture is that because he left Germany under orders in 1934, he wasn't present in Germany for the worst of the Nazis' genocidal efforts against the Jews. He wasn't present for the Nuremberg Laws or Kristallnacht. He was already underground in the stronghold in Canada by the time the Einsatzgruppen were set on the loose. So he may not have known about them. And by the same logic, he probably couldn't have known about the Wannsee Conference or the death camps or the final solution. He may have learned about all this during his re-education online by watching every single thing on Netflix, because they would have had numerous documentaries and films about the Holocaust. They still do. And if he was trying to figure out what had happened in the intervening 60 years to ground himself in the present, he probably couldn't have avoided noticing them if he tried. And if he had, what would he have thought about seeing them? We're talking about a man who's fine with killing people to make sculptures out of them. I don't know if his sense of empathy would have kicked in when learning about the medical experiments or the gas chambers, or the mass shooting pits, or any other part of that barbarism. But we don't know what he thought. The theory I have that fits in with his thinking prior to this is that Adam himself in the Talmud is seen as the first man and as a golem in the Talmud, a man created from dust, just like golems are in folklore. So is the goalie golem yet another manifestation of Arcane's desire to create the new man, the previous attempt having failed? I'm That's a thought. We're now getting into the final stretch here. Point 38, Arcane launched his Day of Wrath in late February 2015. I date it to that because the website CanadianCorpses.com, as seen in the film, has this message board, and the dates on it are February 16th, 2015, a day before my birthday, by the way. And the message board is implied to be relatively recent. That helps me map this in time. He had 6 months to collect and assemble body parts. The goalie golem was either ready or nearly ready. We don't know how many victims had been murdered in those 6 months, but the sculpture had the skulls of at least 6 victims, the rib cages of at least 4 victims, and the peeled skins of an uncounted number of victims of various ethnicities sewn together in a way that would have made Mr. Tusk to envy. And as the Canadian Corpses message board says, body parts in bits of pieces have been found all over town in Winnipeg. Arms, legs, heads, scalps, torsos, feet, hands, nipples, dinkies. Now, obviously, these parts were found because they were left behind by the clones after they killed the victims. Did they dismember the bodies at the murder sites and only bring back the parts Arcane needed? Would seem to make sense. And the only thing that would have been consistent to investigators is that the bodies were all rectally breached, that they all had massive internal damage, and that they all were missing organs, but not the same organs consistently from body to body. And Francois Roy, affectionately known as the Toilet Paper Man, is the last victim from which Arcane obtained any viable body parts.
Mm-hmm.
This is likely, yeah, get out of my bum! Ah! This is likely when Guy Lapointe got involved in the case, but we don't know. Hunter Calloway and Gordon Greenleaf were the last proxy victims of Arcane, but the clones themselves were killed by the Colleens before they could harvest any usable parts. By the way, they were great at their death scenes. They really sold something that, as we've talked about, is very difficult to sell. I've been murdered
Yep.
by a bratwurst that walks around. By the way, I know where they got the Mountie McBeaver doll outfits to wear. Where did they find the little Pickelhauben, the leather spiked helmets to fit? They weren't on sale at the A to Z.
Yeah, I'm
Now,
not sure.
I have no idea, and neither do you. Maybe Kevin knows, maybe he doesn't. Let me check the alignment of my camera. Hello. I am now in the center of the world again. Now, the fight scene in the A to Z, where the Colleens kill a whole bunch of the clones, this ends up forcing Arcane to accelerate his plans somewhat. He'd sent them to obtain fresh victims. They'd failed to return. They didn't bring victims back either. Arcane is not stupid. He deduced that the clones were intercepted and stopped. And because he doesn't know the Colleens are involved, unless he had a means of seeing in there, maybe he does, then that means that the authorities have become aware of his existence. About time. But as the goalie golem was largely ready for unveiling, Arcane decided that the time had come to reveal himself and his new art to the world. He'd arranged for the Colleens to take pictures of him standing alongside his art, and then he'd release them and wait until Them Weekly magazine published them, and the reception became apparent. He probably wasn't going to harm the Colleens. He said, "You see, I brought the Colleens here to help me. I have a need for their very specialized skills. Don't you know?" What he needed was their cell phones. And the two people who knew how to use them that he was aware of, that could take pictures with them, were the Colleens. He didn't understand yet that everybody had cell phones. He knew the Colleens from watching them from hiding as he accustomed himself to his surroundings, most likely. He'd been watching for nearly a year. After nearly a year, they become familiar. He would use them. When the time was right, he'd bring them to him. They would have the privilege of being the first to behold the product of his genius. Then the popular arts and entertainment media would hail him as the artistic genius he always wanted to be seen as. Then, having humbled the art critics he so hated, he would then use the golem to eradicate them altogether. But not the Colleens. But Mr. Lapointe, you and the Colleens were never in any jeopardy. He was probably going to let them go once he'd sent the golem off on its murder spree. In his distorted mind, they were expected to be awed by his genius and approving of his actions in what he calls my Harry Styles buying bacon moment. But the Colleens didn't have their phones. They were confiscated because of circumstances he had no control over, which brings us to a simple, basic point that brings down all supervillains, and that is no master plan, no matter how well conceived, survives first contact with reality. As Mike Tyson quite elegantly put it in 1987, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And he was an expert. He learned to punch back, but he learned you have to be able to freestyle. You have to be versatile. Arcane wasn't. So he decided he would just go with phase two of his master plan. He had the golem, he had his mission. It would go on whether or not the picture was taken. He could always acquire a camera later. Maybe he could be photographed with his golem standing atop a mountain of the corpses of critics. And that would be aesthetically pleasing to his distorted mind in its own right. But as we know from the film, it didn't go that way, did it? Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And Arcane got punched in the face because the Bratzies had minds of their own. They had an interest in the Colleens of their own. They too had their own will. They could only follow orders to a point. And so when Arcane says, I command you to kill a negative critic right now, they all went, okie dokie, Papa. And they raised their huge hockey stick. Point 40, point the last. Andronicus Arcane died in February 2015 at the chronological age of 119, at the physical age of 50. Which brings the very tortured, involved, and now quite expanded beyond its original purpose biography of Andronicus Arcane to its tragic and pathetic end. And all I can then add after that is to have Arcane have one last line as Ed Wynn and go, so what does everybody think? Because the end.
That was a history lesson.
No
Is what that
shit.
was. But like that was really interesting. It's always great to see when different things from different people like inspire people to do different things and kind of go down those crazy little rabbit holes. And
it wasn't.
this was super dense. I really liked it. We've got a few more things here that we're going to wrap up, and then we're going to sign off here.
Yeah.
For me, I can't talk about a pod without getting some trivia in here overall about how the movie was made. So that's kind of how we're going to bookend this.
Bring this, because we got to bring this to a slow halt, not a sudden one.
One of the coolest things that I found about this movie through like doing research and after like watching it a whole bunch and like listening to like the different podcasts, that like the different podcast episodes like 306 and like 288 and all that kind of stuff that are kind of like leading up into Yoga Hosers here, is that really was a huge family affair. Like obviously
Indeed.
Kevin wrote and directed it. He's the Bratzi, because as I don't know if people know this or not, Jay Muse was originally supposed to be the Bratzies, but he has like a claustrophobia thing and he couldn't do the makeup. couldn't
Mm.
do the crazy like in-depth like prosthetic makeup that they needed to put on to make him the Brazzi. So that's why he becomes the like Guy Lapointe detective who's like, your book is my Bible, and everything in there. So like Kevin aside being the writer, director, editor, also shows up as the Bratzis. You got Jen, Harley's mom and Kevin's wife as Miss Mackenzie. And like she actually has one of my favorite lines as well, is like, make sure you take something stabby.
I love that.
Um
I love her in that. She has an incredible amount of presence. She's a journalist first, not an actor,
yeah.
but she leaps into this as if she was born to it. She's got a good presence to her and a physical presence. I think the closest resemblance she has is to Shirley Eaton, who was in a number of films and would be most known as the girl that got spray painted gold in Goldfinger. But in real life, she wasn't blonde, she was a brunette, even though Jen has been both in her life. Um, and even the facial structure is relatively the same. And they're both roughly the same height. They're both relatively tall and striking. Uh, Good, charismatic, great presence. Good to see her. Um, and yes, this is a family affair. I recall Coppola once saying that movies can be the most expensive home movies ever. He certainly treated it this way. That's why the Godfather series is the way that it is. Um, and yeah, why not here? This is a family affair. It's friends and family getting together to do something fun. And despite all of my bullshit for the past 2 hours, is it? Um, it's still meant to be, as a film, um, a fun affair, just by people having fun, people who know each other, uh, people who went to school together, people, because Los Angeles isn't a huge community, particularly in this particular industry. So, yeah, it's close and it has the feel of that and a very positive one.
And aside from Kevin's family, it's also we got Johnny Depp, we got Lily Rose, obviously opposite Harley in this, but we also get Johnny Depp's other son, Jack, or other kid Jack, and Lily and Jack's mom Vanessa in this. And, like Jack Depp is the Pucky Charms
Yeah.
kid in the A to
Moo,
Z.
moo, you're a loser.
Yeah. And then like that kid's mom is actually Vanessa, their like Lily and Jack's mom, which is awesome.
Is she playing?
Um,
She's playing Ms. Maurice, the history teacher, if I'm not mistaken. Am I right?
who?
Vanessa Paradis.
No, she plays the Pucky Charms kid's mom. It's another woman who plays the history teacher.
Ah, hold
I
on.
forget what's her name, but the woman who plays the history teacher also pops up in Tusk, I
It's
believe.
funny. I guess I made that mistake because there almost seems to be a superficial resemblance between Ms. Maurice and Colleen number two, Colleen Collette.
Yep,
Of course, Lily Rose Depp has moved on to establish herself in acting very nicely. She was in Robert Eggers' Nosferatu. She is doing just fine.
yep.
Um,
She's really great in that.
she's kind of adorable in this, though. She's 14 to 15, and all she does is remind me of my granddaughter Zoe. Like Zoe, she's got full cheeks and a little bit of a dimple hero chin thing, and you just want to pinch her cheeks. And despite all of that, she delivers excellent performance and gives clear hints, just like Austin Butler, of where she would go later. And let me see, as let me see the Pucky Charms guy. Um,
Mhm. The one other thing that I really liked too was Harley's Colleen's M shirt at the end. She has that Camp Antler shirt, which is a nod again to Moose Jaws. I really hope we get a Moose Jaws. I really hope we get Moose Jaws at some point as well. Um, we also talked about Gila Point's mole moving from like different scenes and stuff. Uh,
Yep.
that's always really great. That's really fun.
Yvette and I loved noticing that when we went to see it in the theater. And again, I wonder exactly whether the thing can be visibly seen moving from place to place between shots in the film's universe. I don't even want to speculate on that. That's something out of David Cronenberg
Right.
or The Substance. But
Um, well, I guess without further ado, we'll go ahead and wrap this up here. I want to thank you for joining me on this. This was quite an adventure for it. Um, I am Jimmy with the Triple C Collective. Joining me today is the wonderful
aw,
Eric. Same
Erik
thing.
Pflueger. Oh, yeah, that is my name. Yeah.
Yep.
I'm the Pflug, as Kevin named me, and he was the first person to make me actually appreciate my last name. Uh, and I'm glad you're saying that after talking everyone's ear off for 2 hours, is it? And I do apologize for the length. It had to be that way if I'm gonna get all of my thoughts out. And by the way, they're not all of my thoughts. A lot of other things I've kept close because, again, that's between me and Kevin.
Mhm.
And hopefully the length won't intimidate him. Hopefully he'll have a listen. I did promise him a take on that that was thoughtfully, uniquely mine.
Mhm.
And I think I delivered on that. Could this work as a story in its own right? I think so. You'd simply have to split it into three parts. One of him growing up, coming of age, and becoming a Nazi, and having been a failed sculptor. Two, his time with Archon and being stuck in the stronghold making clones. And three, uh, the third part being him getting up again and resuming his sculpting career and becoming a serial murderer, ending in his tragic death. There's a way to make that work. I'm convinced of it. Um, After this, though, I am going to rightfully take a break from Yoga Hosers for a bit, but I will be present when Kevin Smith does his stop and start commentary on the film in May of this year. I want you to look that up, folks in the audience, if you're still awake, and consider getting a ticket there. I will be there. Kevin and Harley will be there to talk about it. Hopefully, the stars will align in some way.
Yep.
Um, but I got to put away the yoga hosers for a little bit. I got work to do of my own that is outside of that. Some of it's for Kevin, and I can't neglect that, even though it took me a
Yep.
little bit of time to put all this together. And as you can understand why it took that time now.
So,
But
Eric,
I'll go back to the arts.
like I said, I want to thank you for joining me. We hope you all stay safe out there, all of our audience and watchers. Please like and subscribe to our video and to our channel here. Please follow Eric and all of his work. Check out him over on Facebook, Instagram, cygnusarts.com.
Actually, if you want to look that up, folks, it's www.cygnusarts, cygnusartsinc.com. Or, as Jim said, you can follow me on Facebook and reach me that way.
We hope you all stay safe. Please like and subscribe. And with that, you know what? We hope to see you in the real world. Take life one page at a time and stay safe out there.
Thank you all. Stay safe. Thank you for tolerating my rantings for 2 hours. And thank you all for being there for us. And with that, I wish you all a farewell and adieu to you fair Spanish ladies.